Good stuff.
Well, this is pretty easy.
In 1 week?
Well, there are 36 lectures, and I made a commitment to do a lecture a day. Each lecture is 40 minutes.
Huh?
Wow.
So 40 days.
Neat.
And is anybody familiar with great courses?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
It's great courses done by Peterson from George Mason. And he speaks at my level, so I'm enjoying it.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah, anyone who hasn't had the pleasure of taking a really good course on world history should find one. This is the best time in history when it comes to availability of, outstanding courses. Previously, you had to be in the right place at the right time or you missed it and that was it. But now with the internet and with bandwidth big enough that we can do video recordings, the great courses is a good example of someplace where we're able to find, outstanding lecturers and their entire material, available for us.
And they had a major Thanksgiving sale. I think some libraries give it for free, but mine didn't.
Yeah.
But they had a major Thanksgiving sale. So this cost me $30, which I think was well worth it.
Well, if you've got a link, if you're doing this through the internet, you could drop that in the chat and then other people could follow up if they wanted to.
Okay.
Because one of Kenneth's favorites quotes by Goethe is where he says, anyone who cannot recount to themselves the past 3,000 years of history is just drifting through life, aimless, not actually understanding anything that's happening. And, so Sharon, Goethe would approve of what you've done. Well done, you.
Well, that's why last week I raised the question, because he, I hate to say classified, but he designated the different time periods with different words. He called them classical.
Yeah.
And that's why I was asking, because it's a little confusing. This week, when he's talking about the decline of the 3 civilizations, and he considers them all together, Chinese, Indian, and the Middle Eastern, he talks about medieval for the first time. Yeah. And then he reiterated what you said last week, that medieval was Eurocentric.
It is.
It's applied mainly to the countries in what we now consider Europe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the other large cradles of civilization entered their medieval eras at different points in time and for different reasons, and it was structured differently. So there really is a fragmentation that happens during that epoch.
Well, could you delineate some?
Well, so, the struggle to unify China was accomplished at the beginning of their medieval era, whereas our medieval era in Europe was constantly striving to do it and never succeeded, and still hasn't to this day. So it's like a complete inside out, upside down definition of the medieval era. The other component of China's medievalism would be the rise of Neo-Confucianism as a solution to the struggle between the different religions that existed at the time. And the struggle in China was real. I mean, there were militarist Taoists who fought to overthrow emperors. It was a huge deal. So when they managed to come down on Neo-Confucianism as a unifying force that would allow Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism to all coexist, plus Neo-Confucianism co-opted Moism, which we talked about when we did the yin and yang session, it finally gave them the unifying force that Christianity was trying to be for Europe. So, a different structure, different forces are the primary forces at work, but the same goal of the mandate of heaven is what determines, who rules, God's agents on earth. The whole structure of what we think of as European medievalism is present in China for completely different reasons.
That whole theocratic idea could sum up Bronze Age Egypt rather well anyway.
Yeah, Egypt is a much harder case to talk about. They're so strange by comparison with the civilizations we know.
Hey, hang on. I was an Egyptian in my past life. Don't call me strange.
I like strange. I'm a weirdo. Strange is praise for me. But you can do the same thing with Japan. Japan came out of its ancient era and came up with a feudal medieval structure that worked for them for many, many centuries. So, we could sometime, and maybe even over the course of working our way through this book, maybe we'll have some days where we set aside kind of deep dives into some of these other parallel medieval cultures that were going on at the same time as a way to help understand the larger picture.
Well, okay, so medievalism is Christian Rome. When we see Christian Rome appear, it's become medieval.
Well, Christian Rome plus the collapse that led to feudalism, replacing the old societies.
Well, interesting point. The extremely rigid, almost feudalistic Roman Empire began to originate with Aurelian and Diocletian, who massively persecuted the Christians. We'll get rid of these pests once and for all.
Yes.
But yeah, they've gone from the individual spirit of the free Republican Roman or Greek Democrat into the era of the all-powerful Lord, the Domus.
Yeah,
and this was, in a sense, what he's talking about. This sort of medievalism, and then Christianity stepped in as a sort of perfect religion for it.
Yes.
So one of the things that I found interesting in studying this was, as the three civilizations, as he called them, declined, they had commonalities, and they were political, economic, and cultural.
Yes.
Operating in different realms. But once he categorized it like that, it really made a lot of sense.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, a great history class is just indispensable for these things, because they've spent so long immersed in the details that they can draw out the lessons. And instead of being empty abstractions of somebody's bright idea, anytime you ask about, well, why is that true? They can take you back down into the details and show you, well, see, this is what they were doing here, and this is why these guys had to fight. They didn't really have any choice. This struggle had to arise. You get beyond the accidentalism of memorizing facts and names, and you start to get to what was really at stake and why were people living the way they lived and why did they have the struggles they had. Starts to take on the meaning,
Well, I was impressed.
But it seems to me that Chinese history was essentially an internal history within itself, struggling within itself, and that to the degree that it went outwards, it expelled many people from the central steppes that caused a lot of havoc in Europe. And so in some sense, Europe never really consolidated under the Romans totally into a period, so that Europe was always fragmented to a great degree, right?
Yes.
And partly because the Chinese, to a certain degree, through various periods, in a sense, moved a lot of the central steppe people out, and they went to Europe.
So we're not going to be able to do it today. We're not going to be able to do justice to Chinese history today. It's just not possible, along with all the things we're going to talk about. But I think, we should set aside at least one of these sessions where we prepare ourselves and go do the reading and get ready to talk about medievalism from a Chinese perspective. And then, we could do another one on India. We could try that, although it is really one of my weak areas, the medieval era in India. Very interested, just don't know a lot. But we could also do one on Japan, which also had a medieval period. And if other people have other preferences, we could do those too over the course of this year as we work our way through these chapters.
And here again, Korea is left out.
Yeah, we should include it. Korea also had an ancient period and a medieval period, no question. Yeah.
I'm teasing you, Rick.
No, but you're right. You're right. Let's do it. Just not today. I'm totally not ready for that.
Okay, some questions arising from the particular passages in page 2. This is what man's modicum of spirit means, is to be architected to take responsibility in some measure for the terms of his existence. The author of all existence has deputized man to be particular author over his lineage of actions. Now, this is one of my big problems for the last few years. But what is spirit? The painful question for me is, do humans truly have an independent or individual spirit? Nietzsche seemed to suggest as a Superman he could create his own spirit. This gained a strong rebuke from Jung. With Jung, we conceive of the spirit as archetypes. It is the case that man is subjected to a limited pack of pseudo playing cards. This archetype spirits man is involved with are not created by man. So man is not an active creator on the level of the spirit. As such, he does not have a true individual spirit. If a man were to remove all his masks, what would he find behind it? Would it be like Doctor Who's Sutek, upon lifting his mask, finds nothing behind it? I observe that most people don't like questions. Instead, they want answers, or more specifically, solutions. In the commercial world, that which posits solutions is celebrated,
right?
But that which posits questions condemned.
Right.
A mental space with a few rigid answers is the great comfort zone. Here,
Right.
Abrahamics and atheists can sleep until given final rest.
So obviously the opening quote comes right out of this essay, like you said, from the second paragraph under medieval. The rest of it, did you write that?
Yeah.
It's nice. Yeah, it's good.
Mhm.
You're really digging into the questions here.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I thought one of the things that we could do this session is explore some of this. One of the first things that we run into is that remember, one of the running themes in Kenneth Smith's work is the critique that we have a language problem. And the reason we have a language problem is that each worldview wants to posit the world being a certain way and not specifically not the way the world was conceived of in the previous epoch, because each epoch conceives itself in rebellion against the previous one, overthrowing it, being superior to it. The old one is bad, the new one is good. And so there's always at least two definitions for each of these loaded terms, whether it's spirit, soul, free will, man, God, nature. All of these things mean different things to the previous epoch than they mean to the current epoch. Now, when Christianity, not Christianity, this is a line I always try to draw, and I slip back, so you guys have to help me remember this. When medieval Christianity, when medievalism rebelled against the ancient world, it gave answers to all of these questions. Every one of these loaded terms, the medieval world said, well, it's no longer that, now it's this. And the other thing, that's no longer that either, now it's this. And the reason they had to do that is they had a new cosmology that involved the relationships between God and nature and man, and where does meaning come from, and what are our duties and all that. And they couldn't make that mechanism of a worldview work if they were using the old definitions. The old ancient definitions actually, if all you had was them, but you understood them clearly, you would come up with the ancient worldview yourself just out of those definitions. It would seem the logical conclusion about how the world worked. So medievalism.
Okay, definitions, which sounds a bit like almost Jung's archetypes.
Well, so that's the thing, is that when we get to the modern epoch, we have a problem. Because the modern epoch is the first of these epochs that does not base itself on a new system of meaning. It bases itself on an agreement that we're not going to decide what things mean. We're just going to be practical. And so everybody can have a different opinion, and we'll all get together and vote to find out whose opinion wins. Right? This is modernism, that people will decide. It won't be imposed by nature. It won't be imposed by religious orthodoxy. It will just be imposed by people getting together and voting on what the right definition is. And the consequence of that is what we read in the opening, chapter of this, where he says, one of the most characteristic features of the modern epoch is that all the most loaded terms of meaning have no single one definition. and they don't even all come from one epoch. We have fragments of ancient meaning floating around in our culture, and we have fragments of medieval meaning, and we have fragments of sort of modern nihilism and myriad other things. And it's like they're all swirling around and people just glom onto whatever they accidentally grew up in within this maelstrom. The result is words like spirit don't mean one thing to a modern. It depends on which modern you ask what they mean. And so when we have these discussions about, well, what does spirit mean and what does soul mean? These questions in the modern context are essentially cannot be answered. We could try to impose a meaning and claim that our meaning is the right one and try to battle everybody else to prove we're right.
Okay. Here, the medieval church defined the soul,
yes,
as that action which objectifies what is subjective to other natures. For example, man is aware of the fact, consciously, objectively aware that he's a creature with feeling.
Yes.
Objectively aware that he's a creature that has thoughts, and objectively aware that he's actually aware as well. That was what the medieval church defined as soul and what put man above the animals. Now, spirit, the best proxy that I can find for spirit is imagination, very much in the direction of Jung's archetypes.
So the challenge is that what you're going to find is that the medieval concept of spirit and soul were also not 100% unitary. What Augustine believes the soul is and what Aquinas believes the soul is are not exactly the same thing, right? Augustine is taking a more Platonic conception of the soul and the spirit, whereas Augustine is taking a more Aristotelian conception. And so as a result, once Aquinas gets into the picture, the medieval conception of the soul starts to take on some ancient color that it had previously rejected. So we're not going to be able to come up with a straightforward answer like, Jung is right about this and Freud is right about that and Nietzsche's got this part right. What we're going to find with all these moderns is that they are defining as moderns, looking back and trying to imagine.
Well, my demand is not an answer or a solution. My demand is not an answer or a solution.
Yes.
Rather, a better appraisal of the question.
Exactly. So, what we're doing with this book is we're trying to get an understanding of the difference between the ancient conception of spirit and soul, the medieval conceptions of spirit and soul, and the modern conceptions of spirit and soul. And one way to see that is that the ancients believed that your soul corresponded to your character. That is the part of you that wants to behave in certain kinds of ways naturally, that follows its own internal laws of growth, unfolding, new stages of order, just like a plant unfolds new stages of order from the bud, the blossom, and the fruit. This idea is that there's a nature around us that we're inside of physically, and then there's a nature within us that's every bit as complex and every bit as driven by a sort of set of natural laws. But the challenge is that we think of what's inside of us as ourselves. We come to take it for granted and assume we must know what's in there, even though it's so complex that if we actually spent our entire lives trying to understand it, we still wouldn't. It's too big, just like the world outside of us is too big. And so between these two natures, the one outside of us and the one inside of us, it's often easier for us to appreciate that the natural world outside of us is in fact bigger than we are, and that we're just going to understand part of it. But by the same token, it's too easy for us to imagine that the world, the nature inside of us, is small enough for us to comprehend and maybe even rule over, that we know who we are and we know what we want and we know what we're going to do. And that's why the Oracle at Delphi has to say gnothe se auton, know thyself, because they're trying to remind you that familiar impression of omniscience about ourselves is deeply mistaken, that we are far more complicated than we think we are, and that there's an enormous burden of mystery that we have about ourselves, that we don't understand about ourselves, that's driving our behavior far beyond what our conscious will has chosen. And all of that is the subject of soul in the ancient world. That's the whole area of character and soul and ethos is what is all that nature going on inside of us and what does it do? Obviously, from a medieval perspective, since the medieval revolution overthrew nature and said not nature but God is in charge of everything. And nature in fact means nothing. The only meaning that nature has is whatever God gives to it, because God made it out of nothing, ex nihilo. And therefore it had no matter that could contaminate his designs by imposing, limitations upon what he could do with it. He could do anything he wanted with it, and he made it exactly the way he wanted it. So it means nothing. The only thing that has meaning is the creator himself. If that's your conception, and it was for the medievals, then soul has to change. Soul can't be this realm of natural laws inside of us that we're subject to and don't understand. That's anathema. It can't be a source of meaning because it's a kind of nature, and nature's not allowed to have meaning. So the soul instead had to be entirely redefined in the medieval epoch as something involving God. If it was going to have meaning, it better involve God and not involve nature, first of all, right? And second of all, when we look at the structure of salvation, what we see is that the soul ends up being turned into the only coin that matters, right? The soul is the thing worth saving. Our bodies are not worth saving. Our mortal life is not worth saving. But the soul, if it asks for forgiveness, if it is obedient to God's law, then it has the option of being, entered into eternity. And so therefore, it's the great bargaining chip between God and man.
Apparently, the human soul is the only thing which can ask for forgiveness.
Right. That's a medieval conception. Exactly.
An animal can't theoretically ask for forgiveness.
In the medieval concept, that is exactly right. Right, because the animals are just part of nature. God made them, whatever. But our soul's the important part. God gave us that through his grace. And if we're responsible with it, and if we focus on it and on him, then it will be allowed to reach its full fruition after we die, when God saves us and takes us to paradise. So this is a radically different conception.
But atheists go to paradise as well, That
what do?
Atheists go to paradise as well. Their paradise is non-existence.
Well, not in the medieval conception. In the medieval conception,
atheists.
Nobody gets to go to non-existence. You either go to eternal reward or you go to eternal torture.
Yeah, I mean, the contemporary atheist paradise is giving up existence to become the candle light, which goes out.
Sure.
Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that fantastic that you can escape existence? All the weariness, all the pains, all those card games that people have to keep in club meetings. You can finally give it all up. You don't have to worry about anything at all. It's heaven. Atheist heaven, non-existence is heaven.
There's sort of a wheel of karma thing going on with the way you're defining that, which is interesting. Like it's the escape, right? So we'll
ultimate escape is atheism, the greatest religion that was ever created.
We'll spend some real quality time with the modern order. Kenneth does not shy away from critiquing modernism, just like he critiques the others. But our challenge at the moment is to learn to see the medieval conceptions of soul and spirit without the contamination of our modernist lenses, because our inclination is to read back into those earlier epochs and try to rewrite them as versions of ourselves, and to think that they saw the world the way we did, and that therefore they must have meant by soul what we mean by soul. And nothing could be further from the truth. Because every one of these loaded terms that defines the philosophy of the era is something that gets overthrown when the new epoch arises. It's what defines the new epoch, that it was incompatible with the old meanings and the old terms. And Dave, your cat is adorable. I just got to say, I'm a cat lover myself. I've got one on my lap, so kudos. So what we need to do for the moment is try to separate Nietzsche's conception of the soul and Jung's conception of the soul and an atheist conception of the soul. We want to be able to put those on a shelf. And yeah, we may take them off from time to time during the medieval discussion and do comparison, but then we got to be able to put them back and understand that none of them is going to be the medieval conception of the soul. It's a different thing that takes place in a different context for different reasons. So I'm going to do Phil and then Sharon. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I must say that the way you describe of the ancients seem more appealing to me than the medieval in this sense. You know, according to the medievals, God gave man. Man was the only one, I would say, human beings. Man has a sexist connotation, but human beings, free will. But it was really the moderns that took the free will seriously, because in the Middle Ages, it seems to me free will was a sham in this sense, right? In other words, you have a free will, supposedly, but it was kind of a test.
Yes.
Whether you will find the right answers. So there's a final exam coming up.
Yes.
Right? You could be free as you want, but there's
That's
a
right.
final exam. Okay.
Right.
And you have better not just cram for the exam.
Oh yeah. That's
because it's
You
going
can't
to
fool
come
God.
down. It's going to come down on you so that you're not really free. You are free to find the right answers that God gave you.
That's
Right?
right.
And if you don't pass that, there will be hell to pay. I mean, literally, in this case, right? Literally
Yeah.
hell to pay. So
Yeah.
you are not free. You are free to follow this role. And it was really the moderns that took the free will seriously. Now we are free and we can actually find who we are rather than the medieval. You can only find what God made you to be. And that is not free will. You could say a restricted free will within the semester. Maybe you could say that. And you could goof off. You could have all the beer parties, whatever you want. But when the final exam down, there's going to be an F coming.
Right.
And that is not going to be good. And so therefore, in a sense, the fact they even preach, and that's why, you know, Lucifer got envious because of why did they get free will? But because they're going to fall into a trap. And because Lucifer said, you should have given it to the angels, at least they will find the right answers. These people, they're just going to party all night and then they're going to suffer. I mean, that is not free will.
The Muslims, the jinns have free will, apparently. The angels don't, but the jinns. So Lucifer was one of the jinns.
Okay, all right. But so therefore I could see, like, why even coin it as free will? I mean, it's like restricted will, maybe, but not free.
Well, it's incredibly important that it be free will. From a medieval perspective, it has to be free will. See, remember, God is all powerful, God is all knowing, God made everything, and God is all good. So the question is, where does evil come from in this framework? This is the core question that's raised by the structure of the medieval version of the cosmos. And the solution in the medieval version of the cosmos is that it comes from sin. It comes from free will being used the wrong way, right? God gave you the capacity to do the right thing, but he also gave you this gift of freedom. And because you have the gift of freedom, you are non-deterministic. You can choose whatever you want to choose. So if you choose a bad thing, that's not on God, because free will is what makes it be on you and not on him.
Well, wait a minute. That's a flaw. That's a flaw in its own. Okay. And
well, no, this is the whole centerpiece. This is the center.
I understand, but that I'm going to now criticize the flaw. The flaw is God made the imperfect man. Okay. If he really wanted to get free will and find that he would make the perfect man, he made a flawed person, and that he expect the flawed person to find the right person, but it is rigged from the beginning.
I'm going to interrupt you, Phil.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm going to interrupt you is that at a meta level, you're violating what we're attempting to do here.
Okay.
Because what you're doing is you're critiquing the medieval perspective from a modern perspective.
All right.
We're not there yet. Oh, we'll come to that. Believe me, we will. But before we can honestly, fairly critique the medieval perspective, we have to fully immerse ourselves in it. And to fully immerse ourselves in it, we have to understand it from the medieval perspective. God didn't build the flaws in us. God made us perfectly. We're perfect. And the reason is no matter how bad your circumstances when you're born, your free will and your soul give you the capacity to do the right thing. That is the very definition of what they are.
Okay.
And, if we don't see that, then we're not seeing the medieval perspective. We aren't getting how it all.
Would Augustine have agreed with that?
Well, Augustine is helping that vision of the soul arise. He's one of the co-authors. So part of it he would agree with, because part of it is what he's proposing. Part of it comes from medieval mystics, like Hildegard von Bingen and others. Part of it's coming from Aquinas. Any one of these epochs doesn't fully understand itself when it begins. When it begins, it understands itself in opposition to what was previously the dominant epoch. It sees itself as the underdog, rebelling against tyranny. That's how moderns saw themselves. They didn't see themselves as a world-straddling, nuke-wielding, on the moon walking, great power. It saw itself as a bunch of people who didn't want to be burned as heretics, right? There were people who were trying to fight back against the orthodoxy of medievalism. So it was the same for medievalism in the beginning. In the beginning, they were defined entirely in terms of what they weren't, what the ancients were that they weren't, and how different they were. But once they won, this is the crisis that ensues in the development of an epoch. Once they won, half of their definition of themselves collapsed all around them. It's like, well, if I'm not the one who's overthrowing Rome because Rome fell and now we're in charge, then who am I? And this became the crisis for the next several centuries for the medieval epoch, is who are we when we aren't the underdog?
Yeah, you've illustrated the problem there. Mass movements in history always depend on a context. The Enlightenment depended on the context of the Inquisition and the witch burners. Once it's gotten rid of them, what's the Enlightenment then?
Exactly. This is where we get into that Hegelian notion of the bud, the blossom, and the fruit, is that each of these epochs goes through stages that are not arbitrarily defined by some philosopher defining things in a study, but that are defined by the real circumstances that those ages arose out of, why they arose out of it, what they were struggling against, and then what happens when the old shell falls away and they've been pushing against it so hard, and now suddenly they lurch because all that force has been removed. And they have to lurch into a new definition, a new conception of themselves. And you get this new period of creativity where they begin saying, well, if I'm not the underdog being oppressed by Rome, then who am I? And you start to get new theologians and philosophers arising who say, well, let's look at what we've got in the way of a theology and a cosmology and see if we can't cobble together in a hurry, because we don't want to seem incompetent. So sort of in a hurry, we need to look at what we've said and cobble together a new framework that defines us so that we can stand alone by ourselves. Without.
So are you saying that revisionism is a necessity in the evolution of culture and history?
Yes. Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yes. That's right. Yeah, medievalism got a lot of mileage out of those cruel Romans. They tortured us, they murdered us, they threw us to the lions, they crucified us, and then suddenly they weren't doing it anymore.
Yeah.
Well, now who are we? Well, we can't be those guys anymore because none of it's happening. If we keep belaboring this point, it's going to raise the question, well, who's torturing us? They're all gone. Now who's torturing you, right? And that question, I don't mean to mock it at all, even if it sounds like I am. It's a very human, there is some humor to it, but it's a very human dilemma to be in, that when you win, it causes a crisis because you have always been in opposition. So all that force, all that ferocity, all that rage to overthrow the injustice of the late Roman Empire, where could it go now? It had been stoked up for centuries in opposition, right? But now what? We won, we're in charge. So the rest of the medieval epoch comes from the answer to that question.
What do you do when you're the Khmer Rouge and you've come out of the jungle and now you command?
Right. Every group has this problem if they succeed. Right. So the definition of the soul, right, isn't just, it's not going to be a mistake. There's not going to be some easy flaw in it. if it looks like it has an easy flaw, it's because we're looking at it from a modern perspective and interpreting it as a modern thing, which it wasn't to them. It was something very different to them. They really believed.
Okay, so is the soul a subject or an object?
Yes, it is both. It is both.
Well, no, atheists asked me where my soul was, and I was a bit.
And now you're talking moderns, though, right? Atheism was not fundamentally a medieval phenomenon. That was there. It's not that there weren't any atheists, but it wasn't the dominant culture then. So I'm going to set this aside for a second and go on to Sharon. Go ahead, Sharon.
So I want you to comment on the way I'm thinking about this.
Yeah.
So the concept of soul and spirit as cultivated by Christianity and manifested in the life you live, and heaven and hell. The reason the Romans adopted it was, I think, because again, that was a tool for control. If you were good and you behaved, then you went to heaven. And that's the time when I think Constantine put together the scriptural texts, right? He was the first guy to put the Bible together. And in the text here, Kenneth Smith kind of alludes to Christianity as a ruling power rather than a theology, where he said, at the top of the page for me, I don't know what number this is, but it says Christianity invokes a new dispensation, not nature, but God has dealt men their ultimate talents and powers, their potential and raw materials of soul, and therefore the seeds of self-mastery are arguably, that's what we're talking about, universally disseminated.
Yes.
Only how humans employ their own powers. Only how humans employ their own powers of will can determine who will make of himself a slave. Natural fate is not ultimate or decisive, but rather the benighted will that ratifies the condition for itself.
Yes.
So spirit and soul, when we try to understand it in the medieval context, it was part of the culture, and it was the ruling culture.
Yes.
That's the way I see it. And I don't think there were any atheists at the time, because theirs was not to question why.
Yes.
Theirs was just but to do. And so you can comment on how I see that.
Yeah. Well, I always talk about how you have a gift for picking out the very most critical sentences out of the essay, and you did it again. This is in some ways the cornerstone of the foundation of this entire discussion. So I'd really love to unpack this for us some. One of the things to understand is that in the struggle between the ancient worldview represented by the late Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity, and this is, at this point, we're talking a pre-medieval Christianity, right? We're talking in the beginning, we're talking a Christianity that is very not orthodox. And then there's a wave in the 100s and 200s. There's a rising wave of orthodoxy that's attempting to tame all these mad prophets in the desert and all these people who are claiming, like Paul, that they can talk directly to God and see visions, and they're not all agreeing with each other about what they're seeing. And the Orthodox people are going, this is never going to work. We've got to wield together a single religion out of all these different people who are saying that they speak directly to God. And the only way to do that is we've got to suppress the prophets and say, well, that's nice, and there was a time and place for that, but it's over, and now you need to pay attention to the orthodoxy that we're going to give you. We're going to give you this dogma, and you need to follow it, and we'll tell you if any new miracles arise, but otherwise shut the hell up and get in line. And it was as they did that struggle with the early Christian church to replace it with an Orthodox church that they started to look more and more appealing to the Roman Empire, because a bunch of people running all over the place having different ideas about God is what they didn't like about the Jews. Right, there were all these splinter Jewish movements around the year 0 and in between then and 100, and even in the previous 100 years, that were driving a lot of the Roman violence and cruelty against the Jews. Because not coincidentally, a lot of these pre-Christian Jewish visionary said, God tells me that we shouldn't be subject to the Roman Empire. God tells me those people are not godly and that this whole thing is wrong and that we should overthrow the Romans. And since God can do anything, he's going to give us the power to overthrow the Romans. And so let's all rush the centurions and see what happens. There's an enormous amount of this kind of ferment going on for the 200-year period before and after Christ's birth. And so the Romans were really not keen on the Jews for that reason, because their fervor led them to keep rebelling. So the early Christians, when they arose, they inherited a whole bunch of that. There were a lot of very fervent Christians who, again, were like, who's Caesar to tell us what to do? We serve the Son of God. And that's far more important. But the rising Orthodox movement realized that if they could harness and leash all that and put a muzzle on it, that the other parts of Christianity might be compatible with what the Roman Empire was looking for in a good citizen. And if they could do that, then they could get the Roman authorities to cooperate with them in spreading it. That was the vision that the Orthodox had when they arose in the 100s and 200s, and it culminated in the formation of a canon. I think it was at the 300s. I can't remember exactly which century it is. They nailed it down, but it took them a while, right?
But Christianity. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sharon.
But Christianity also gave them some help when Jesus said, "Render to Caesar what is Caesar's."
Yes.
That was deferring control, saying, yeah, we live here, right?
Yes.
And Paul talked about the duty of slaves.
Yes. Yes.
And so there's this subtle tool of, I hate to say submission, but that is what it is, to the political hierarchy.
That's right.
And it's mentioned several times in the New Testament. The second thing is about spirit and soul, is the process of the transfiguration, if you remember that. When Jesus died, he got resurrected, and then he just went straight up into heaven. That was part of the mysticism. And during this medieval time, I think, is when we had a lot of the construction of the churches in Europe. Am I correct about that?
Yes.
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 And if you look at the stained glass windows, you can see a lot of the tales, a lot of the stories of Christianity, because most of the populace was illiterate.
Exactly. So part of what's happening, you remember in the late medieval period, there was an enormous struggle over whether the Bible would be allowed to be translated into the vernacular of various countries. That was one of the things that led to the Protestant, revolution against Catholicism, was the anger that people were not allowed to read the Bible for themselves. But what the Orthodox Church was saying is, it would not be good if anybody and everybody could read the Bible for themselves, because it's not straightforward. The Bible doesn't just come out and say in a clear, simple language, this is what God wants you to do. Instead, there are all these stories about people who were portrayed heroically, but actually did the wrong thing, and you shouldn't follow them. And then there's other places where one gospel says one thing and another says another, and they say it requires all this time that they spend studying to learn how to interpret the Bible to make sense for the medieval world. And if you just turn it loose on a bunch of people who don't have that background, who knows what they're going to do? They might become fundamentalists and believe that every word of it's true, which the Orthodox Church knew was not true. The Orthodox Church knew that the Bible is a human construct, and that it's, as such, it requires an enormous amount of cultivation to get to the point where you can read it and understand it. So one of the reasons that they didn't want people reading the Bible for themselves is, yes, there are passages that say you should be a slave to God, not to any human being. You should submit to the will of the divine, because he's the only trustworthy source. But then there's other passages that say, oh yeah, you should also submit to God's agents on earth. Right, and that became the whole framework for the medieval feudal structure, the mandate of heaven. Right, that God's divine right is imbued in the kings, and that's why they're given the authority over you to rule. There's some of that in certain places that they draw on, but there's also, especially in the Old Testament, the will to rebel. Mm-hmm. Right, the Old Testament is full of throwing off the chains and fighting the conquerors, and yeah, you may rule now, but your day will come, and we'll rise up again. And they really didn't want ordinary Christians reading those particular passages at a time when they're trying to make peace with Rome and become part of the institution of this great empire. So the split between Christianity being a personal religion a house religion in which there is no hierarchy and anybody might be filled with the Spirit of God and speak God's words at any moment. It could happen. You could have a vision right now and God could speak to you. The shift from that early Christianity to the Orthodox Christianity, where we really need to put a lid on that. We'll let you know if any miracles occur, but in the meantime, just learn the stories, follow the rules, don't rock the boat, and see if maybe the Romans will let us, be a big deal here. This was an enormous struggle right around the period you're talking about, the rise of the medieval era.
So one final thing here, we're talking about that when Constantine and the Council of Nicaea constructed the scriptures, there were many books that they left out.
Most of them.
Because of exactly what you're talking about.
Yes.
They were too controversial. They were too inflammatory. And the Council of Nicaea was afraid that it would incite the ordinary people. So he took them out. And that's why we have all these books that are not in the Bible.
That's right.
Right. Because it was a way to politically control the people.
Yeah. I mean, that was a huge part of it. They were trying to not be an exciting fringe religion, but to become the central religion. They wanted to stop being the persecuted outsiders, and they wanted to become the people in the room, the people at the table, if you know what I mean. And to do that, they had to de-emphasize some parts of Christianity and seriously emphasize other parts. And so that's why we can't. Sometimes Kenneth slips in here and uses Christianity as a synonym for medievalism, and he gets that from Nietzsche. But mostly what he means is he does mean to distinguish early Christianity from medieval Christianity. They're very different things, even though they're deeply related. They're very different things. And for the same reason, what Christianity has become today and what we imagine Christianity is when we talk about it, whether we talk about it in a fideist, faith-based way, or whether we talk about it in an atheist, criticizing way, no matter how we do it as moderns, we aren't really talking about medieval Christianity because we don't understand it. And we also aren't really talking about early Christianity because we don't understand that either. We would have to understand the ancient worldview to understand what Christianity began as, what it arose within. And we'd have to understand both of those things in order to understand what the medieval version of Christianity became and why it did it. And so that's part of what we're going to do in this book, is we're going to fill in those gaps and get we want to cultivate in ourselves, not perfectly, because it's not possible, but better than we have now, the ability to take our perspective out of the modern perspective and put it into the ancient perspective, and then take it out of that and put it into the medieval perspective, to go back and forth between these three lens systems so that we can turn them on each other and go, whoa, is that what modernism is? What is modernism from a medieval perspective is something that we ought to be able to answer. We ought to be able to understand, but we aren't taught that in school. We aren't taught it by popular culture. We're not given any way to develop that set of skills. And the same is true for the even further distant ancient perspective. What would it have to say about the modern era? And what would it have to say about the medieval era? Once you get all three of them looking at each other, the number of optics significantly increases, and our ability to understand ourselves and our place in history significantly increases. But it requires this ability to not have an allegiance to any of them. We need to gain, right? We're cultivated to have an allegiance to only the one view. We're taught that only the modern view is right. We're the most truest, the most objectivist, the most scientific people that ever existed, and everybody else was stupid, and we're the ones who are right. This is what we're taught. We have a God-given right, or an evolution-given right, or a science-given right to know things the way they really are for the first time in history. This is what we're told. This is how we're raised. And when you have that level of overconfidence in yourself, it destroys curiosity about other perspectives. So that's what this book is trying to do, is get us to where we can break free of those shackles and get to where we can hop back and forth between them. Phil and then Dave. Actually, I'm going to call Dave before Phil because we haven't heard from Dave before, and then I'll call on Phil if that's good. If that's fine with you, Phil.
And you may never want to again. But no, I want to add some clarification to this idea of a Christian rebellion against the Romans. That I was raised a Christian, and I never knew about it until later as an agnostic and atheist. I'm learning. But the Maccabees,
I believe
Yes.
it's a book in the Apocrypha.
Yes.
And there had been several rebels attempting to start revolutions against the Romans because the Romans were an occupying army. You know, think about, the Americans in Vietnam or, whatever. Anytime there's an occupying force or army, people are upset about it. But,
Yes.
and the other, because I don't know if it was the Maccabees or another rebellion, anyway, it ended up at Masada. That story was on TV a few years ago about
Yes.
the final defeat of the Israelis by the Romans.
Yeah.
But because that stuff had happened, that's why when Jesus entered Jerusalem on Holy Week, they thought they were going to get this guy on a white stallion in his general's uniform, leading rebellion and going to throw the Romans out.
Right.
No one in Christianity ever talks about why that expectation was there and why Jesus symbolically rode a mule into Jerusalem saying, I'm not going to be the general throwing the Romans out. No, I'm here to rescue your souls or whatever. But anyway, my 2 bits were just to rant out because most Christians don't even know about the Maccabees and this stuff. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. So
yes,
yeah,
I know about the Maccabees. I've been to
Sharon.
Masada.
That's
I've been to
right.
Masada, yes.
Yeah, that film Masada also is if anyone has not seen the film Masada, it needs to be seen. It's an incredibly important frame of reference for understanding this period. It was a very violent confrontational period.
You mean the mini-series?
Yeah.
Oh, there was the mini-series. I was wondering what you mean, the film Masada.
Oh yes, that's what I'm referring to. Yeah.
Well, that's the famous mountain fort, right? That the
Yes.
Romans had a great deal of trouble. Yeah, they're an important movement. Yes, that was kind of almost the last rebellion or something. At least the last major rebellion.
It was a major turning point, but they really never stopped fighting.
Yeah.
So okay. Thank you for that, Dave. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I want to return to the notion of revisionism because that's important because that really is incorporated. I see it now as a picture that Hegel talks about the evolution of culture, because first you have a revolutionary period to overthrow the other, right?
Yeah.
That makes sense, okay, because they are the oppressors and you want at least to get them off your back, if nothing else. But after you achieve that, then it becomes a period of consolidation, right? I mean, like, I guess you could just we leave all enough alone, go back and disperse, but you become the period of consolidation. And within that, I think consolidation not only means leaving certain things out that contradicts, which is exactly what happened in Mysia. And then, but also revisionism means tinkering with the story to revise it so that it could become more homogeneous and unifying and consistent, right? And that's also consistent with the notion of reason turning into rationalization.
Yes.
So in some sense, this all comes together, a consolidation of power. So really what's underneath it is at least the power on earth, if you want to say it that way, in order to govern, because you are the ruling power. I wouldn't say necessarily bad. I mean, somebody have to take control. I mean, otherwise it just falls into, I guess, chaos or something. And so that revisionism is a necessary part of constructing a consolidation of unification of some sort. But I think what happens is that consolidation in some sense creates such a singularity that it in a sense creates another oppressive power that leads to another revolution, right? Because anytime you lead to a singularity, it does shut off diversity enough that many people feel like, well, wait a minute, what are we supposed to do? That kind of thing. So the cycle begins. And that seems to me like, so you usually think of revisionism as a kind of dirty word in some sense, but it's actually just an evolutionary word.
It is.
That's wrapped up in the process of
Yes.
consolidation. Now, maybe you could say consolidation is a bad word. I don't know, but now I wonder whether we are in a revisionist period.
Right.
I
It
mean,
raises
now the modern
questions.
period, because the force is trying to consolidate, and there's still resistance and the consolidation. So I don't know how it's going to go, but eventually there's going to be eruption at some point.
Yeah. Anytime you work with incredibly complex systems like living systems, organic order is, you discover that the mechanistic design-driven models that we're taught don't work at all.
Mhm.
At all. They lead to calamity, because you get the baby with the bathwater problem. Okay, version 2, we're going to make a brand new version 2 from scratch, and lo and behold, it has all kinds of problems that had already been fixed correctly in version 1, because we started over from scratch. If you throw everything out, you throw out all your solutions too. And there's only a certain amount that you can design correctly ex nihilo, because no matter how proud we are of our brains, we aren't God. We can't actually do what we imagine God can do. And although we never stop trying, because we're moderns and we worship ourselves, so we keep going back to the design board, inventing from scratch, making all kinds of blunders that we had previously gotten right, and it embarrasses us. So with complex systems, you get a shift away from the design ex nihilo model to incremental iterative improvement, where you say, we're going to keep everything, and we're just going to fix things that we identify that are broken. And we're going to do this over and over. And over time, the system will get better and better, because we will be keeping the parts that worked instead of starting over from scratch. And so the number of things that work correctly can grow. This is how nature does things. This is why the Hegelian dialectics work the way that they do. The bud, the blossom, the fruit, each one negates things about the previous state of existence, but it doesn't throw it out and start over. It builds from within itself.
Yeah, because it's important to know that that's both a construction, but there's also a sort of deconstruction, a criticism of itself. So in some sense, it's a kind of like, let's call it a contained explosion, if you want to call it that way.
Yeah.
Right? An implosion. So, I use the word revisionism quite often, but you're always a little skittish about using that word, because
it's a tricky term. It has a lot of
because it has a lot of negative connotation, but also it seems to me there's also some positive connotation.
That's right. That's right. In computer science, we talk about, what do you do if you've got a program that works correctly, but it was written in an older era when there wasn't much memory. And so people used very short variable names that are cryptic. They left out the comments because that would have taken up space. Everything is made as clever as it can be, which means that anytime you're not at the height of your powers, you can't understand it. If you're tired, if it's in the afternoon, if you've been woken up at 3 a.m. because the hospital's in crisis and you have to fix this code, and you look at it and you're like, I went to a party, I had plenty to drink. I didn't think I was going to be working on this at 3 a.m. And now here I am, and the hospital's down, and I'm at the bottom of my powers instead of the top of my powers. Not only can't I understand this clever piece of code written in 1968, I can't even understand a clever piece of code I wrote yesterday, because I was too clever. I was at the height of my powers. And so you learn that in order to handle those situations, what you want to do is replace those subroutines with modernly written subroutines, in which you say, you know what? We have more space now. We can afford to use longer names. We can put comments in. We can make simpler algorithms that are easier to fix, that aren't so fragile, and what this process is, we distinguish between rewriting, which is where you start from scratch, and then rewriting has all the problems I mentioned before. It's now you're going to throw out a whole bunch of things that used to work, and you're going to make a whole bunch of mistakes, versus refactoring. And refactoring is where you start with the code and you just incrementally start changing one variable name and get it changed all the way through. And then you change another one and you start adding comments. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of, instead of starting from scratch and making a new thing, the code itself is slowly, incrementally evolving. And what we've learned, and there's whole books on this in computer science, where they say refactoring, is the gift from heaven when it comes to not screwing up complex systems, because you can make significant changes to the code and still keep everything that used to work before if you just do this little incremental. This is revisionism, right, Phil? I mean, ultimately, This is going back and saying, I know we used to call this variable X, but for the love of God, that doesn't tell me anything about what's in here. Can't I call this birthday instead? Because it's actually this guy's birthday, and then when I read the code, then anybody could read the code and know that this variable is about somebody's birthday instead of nobody knowing it, because the variable name was X, this sort of thing. Revisionism. So Christianity, in the transformation into the medieval epoch, had to go through multiple rounds of revisionism. Anything that Paul said that the later Orthodox people didn't like, sometimes they would insert new lines into Paul's letters. Sometimes they would forge letters, but more typically what they did is they really worked over the Gospels, and then they changed the order and put the letters second. And the cleverness of that change made sure that people wouldn't read the letters until after they already had their minds full of the interpretation of the Gospels. And it's why most people who read the Bible have no idea that Paul's version of Christianity is so different from the Orthodox version of Christianity, because we're busy inserting into Paul's letters all the things that we're sure he meant because we read them second. But if we'd read them first, without ever having seen the Gospels, without having gone to Sunday school, we'd be seeing a much closer to the original early house religion, the personal religion of Christianity that preceded the Orthodoxy.
Well, that's a classic relationship between the writer and the editor, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, yes, really, and a good writer needs a very good editor, right? That understands a text and revises a text rather than rewriting it.
Yeah.
And so
that's right. I'll talk about this some more in a moment, but I want to call on Sharon because she's been patient.
So can I say that this all sounds complex to me, but to my simple mind, I think, and you tell me, Rick, if I can safely say that because history is largely an oral tradition, most of it is subject to revisionism, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's human and human memory. And if you want to see revisionism, the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, even though they were all there with Jesus, they have different perspectives of the events that occurred because they all have different roles in this life and they recorded it from that perspective. Now, is that revisionism? Is that in today's world where we live, there's revisionism about the Holocaust, there's a vision about slavery, there's a vision about anything because there's the human element in all of this.
Yeah, that's right. Our perspectives change over time, and we just simply can't understand things the way people used to unless we do what we're doing in this series of seminars, which is actually making a point of trying to do it.
So Dave, go ahead.
Go ahead. No,
so Dave said a comment that I wanted to follow up on. Dave said, when Jesus was riding into Jerusalem, the triumphant entry on a donkey, and everybody put palm fronds in front of him, that was not the expectations of the Jews, right?
That's right.
And that's why when Pontius Pilate said, got the basin of water, washed his hands, and said, I found nothing wrong with this man, they said, let's crucify him. Because that was not their expectation. And if you follow the scriptures, the way Jesus's life was led for the short time, he was fulfilling the prophecies of the Old Testament. And I think, and I am not going to be held accountable for this, I think Jewish people today are still looking forward to their Messiah, because he was not Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So one way to think about that is that different Jewish groups feel differently about that. What they would all agree on is that at that time in history, they looked forward to the Messiah more than they ever have since, pretty much, that was the peak of messianic fervor. And that it's not a coincidence that Christianity arose directly out of that milieu. That was the time and place when they were like, maybe we can overthrow the Romans. Maybe we can do it with God's help. We just need our Messiah to help lead us. Because they'd made numerous efforts that hadn't succeeded. They felt like they knew God was on their side and God's omnipotence, so they knew it could be done. They knew that this tiny community in the Middle East could overthrow the world-spanning Roman Empire. They were certain. So they figured, what is it that we must be getting wrong? We must have our strategy wrong. And if we get the right leader who comes, wielding more of God's wisdom, he can help point us in the direction of the strategy that will definitely allow this tiny group of people to overthrow the entire empire, which they knew could happen. So they were really passionate at that moment in history about happening. Over the thousands of years that have followed, most Jewish people have stopped being at the fever pitch of believing that right now, any moment, we're going to overthrow our oppressors. They've become a much more patient religion. I can't say indigenous, because there are elements of Judaism that have never been indigenous, that have always been, transcendentalist, looking towards another world, looking towards a faith that runs counter to natural law. That was the seedbed of Christianity, after all, and its transcendentalism. But there's certainly some Jews today who are still, some sects of Judaism will talk about the Messiah. It's not, they've never forgotten. It's just it's different priorities for different groups, I'd say, is where that comes down. Dave, and then Sharon. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, another minutia about the Bible, since you're talking about the letters of Paul and the Gospels, that I believe in the sequence, the letters of Paul were written first, according to time.
Yes.
And it's very interesting. There are no mention of any miracles in the letters of Paul. And the other thing about the Gospels, Matthew first, and you can see these sequences about, okay, there's these miracles. Then in Mark, there was, some of these carry over and some don't. Then from Mark to Luke, some carry over from, in that sequence. And then John is completely different. I think there's maybe one miracle that carries.
That's a whole different sect.
So it's very interesting about, were those miracles real, or are they just kind of made up to sell the story? So anyway, just today's comment. Thank you. Bye.
So, setting aside the question of what really happened, which I don't think any of us can resolve because we're not eyewitnesses. What we can say is that, and I think I alluded to this a week or two ago, we're living in a golden age of biblical scholarship. It's incredible. There have been, in the last several decades, there have been incredible movements to go back using kind of 19th, 20th, 21st century disciplines of textual analysis and linguistic studies. We've gotten very good at dating slang and idiom, figures of speech. And so we can tell when a piece of text was written, in the first century BCE, or when was it written in the first century CE, or when was it written in the second or third centuries CE, even though it claims to have been written earlier. And they've gotten very good at taking apart letters, for example, some of the epistles, and saying, well, some of this could be authentic Paul because this is using the right language. But this next passage interrupts a rhyme, and it's written in a later dialect. Paul would never have written the next 3 paragraphs. It's just not even his language. And the way you really know is that once the interruption is over, the very next line rhymes with the line that came before the interruption. Or it sets up a logical syllogism, as X, so Y. And there'll be a part in the letter where Paul's going, da, 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 this is an important point, as X, and then suddenly it goes into about women should close their mouths in church and shouldn't talk. And then after that, it says, so why? And you're like, this letter would make more sense if none of that was in there. And furthermore, this section telling women to shut up doesn't actually match with the rest of what Paul said, because Paul's always talking about women as having the gift of being able to speak with God and have visions, and that they could be leaders in the church, and you should really afford them your attention. It's in Timothy and some of the others that we're pretty sure couldn't possibly have been written by Paul, that you see a lot of the real misogynist stuff come out. And so once they start to pick apart these letters and gospels and say how much of this was original and how much of this was inserted later, you start to get a picture of the theological disputes of the first, second, and third centuries of Christianity, the rise of orthodoxy, and the way that they wanted to put a lid on certain things that had been widespread practice before, like having women be treated as holy and be able to be prophets. Paul was all good with that. He talks about it extensively, except for the passages that are written in a later dialect that somebody shoved into the middle to say, no, shut up, don't talk. I didn't mean what I just said. I definitely didn't mean that. So, just ignore that. And there have been books written analyzing, well, why didn't they just cut out the parts that they didn't like? Why didn't they just remove the parts where Paul says women have the gift and should be allowed to speak in church? And what they've come up with is the idea that the problem that the Orthodox redactors or revisionists had is that there were different communities of Christians in whom these passages were very well known. And if they just vanished out of the letter, whole communities would go, that's not a legitimate letter because we know the following things that we've been saying for the last 75 years. We've been quoting out of that letter. You can't make it go away. But they could add something to it because you can't be sure you've remembered everything. And so the process of revision in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, as the orthodoxy arose, mostly involved in inserting things. It's, oh, I found a better version of the letter. It had this missing paragraph that contradicts everything else the letter said, but don't worry about that. So there's this wrestling match that happens. This tension between the different groups. And one way to understand the 4 different gospels that's really helpful, I think, is less that it was 4 specific witnesses. Because the one thing that the early church fathers agree on, and they wrote about this extensively, and they were men of erudition, is that they didn't know who wrote these letters. When the gospels, they know who wrote the letters. They didn't know who wrote the gospels. And there was a stage in the development of the canon where they just said, well, this sounds like the sort of thing that maybe Luke could have written. And if this person was witness to these events, maybe it was Matthew. They went in and put some authors on top of them, and they said they did it. It's well documented. The church fathers say that they were doing it, but they don't really know who wrote it. We don't really know who wrote the gospels. So the best model that we have now for the gospels is that they were different Christian communities, and they were different traditions in the different Christian communities about what had happened. And they remained oral traditions for a very long time. And then finally, when the new fad arose for writing things down, they're like, you know what? Just because Bob has written down his version doesn't mean our version is wrong. I want to write down our version too, so it's not lost. And that's how we end up with these different gospels. Is they're looking at each other's versions, they're looking at their own traditions and saying, well, I don't want to lose my tradition, so I'm going to document it. And I'm going to write it down, and it becomes a gospel. And maybe back in the beginning, there were witnesses, and the witnesses told somebody who told somebody who told somebody who eventually told the person who wrote it down. But it wouldn't have been written down by the direct eyewitnesses. As far as the early church fathers knew, nobody actually knew who wrote those 4 gospels. But that's what's interesting about the process, right? When you have a cultural movement arising under stress, persecuted at the time that it's arising, with a lot of internal struggle, it's easy for things to get missed in the early days. And this is where Phil's revisionism comes in, for people later on to be playing catch up, trying to make sure things aren't lost, or at least trying to minimize how much is lost by sort of rapidly writing things down. But during periods of oral culture, you often get cultural drift. And that's how, to attend to Sharon's point, that's how you end up with enormous numbers of early Christian writings that aren't any of these gospels, and that the people making the canon had to look through and go, well, of these 40 some odd gospels, how many of them do we believe? How many of them look like they came from the real eyewitnesses, and which ones look like somebody was telling tales, and maybe we'll leave those out of the canon. They really struggled with it, and they wrote a lot about it, and we're fortunate to have a lot of their writings where they were explaining how they thought about it and how they picked and chose what to include and what to leave out. It's a really interesting process. And I think it tells us a lot about the process of the evolution of the medieval era, that they didn't start with an orthodoxy. That when they first started writing things down, there was already disagreement about what Jesus had said. And that they were trying to make an orthodoxy from that position, which is far more challenging and far more difficult than just transcribing, what your Savior tells you. They were in some trouble in the 2nd and 3rd centuries when they were trying to pull all this together. Sharon, and then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon.
So the misogyny, in inverted commas, that you see in the New Testament, I think was a way, as the early Christians tried to establish the churches at Philippi and Colossus and Galatia, it was a way for them to establish leadership. And that, the business of having the men taking the helm and the women in the background, translated all the way into the modern era.
Yeah.
And even today, I don't think we have a female Catholic high archbishop anywhere in the world. You can correct me on this, I'm not Catholic, but I think it's still a very, very male-dominated faith.
Right.
And it had the roots there. The second question I have is the Roman Empire starts coming apart, I think, in the 3rd 500 years. And so there is Eastern Rome and Western Rome, right? Western Roman Empire. And so what we're talking about, the medieval period and Christianity, that's primarily Eastern, right? Yes? No? Maybe.
Western.
Western.
Yes.
Well, this is the thing that's hard to learn about European history if
Yes.
you only ever get it from Western Europeans. They'll tell you Rome was the center. And they'll tell you Rome was the center because they're still angry at Constantinople for not giving in. What the truth is, there was a split, and it stayed split until the fall of Constantinople, until the fall of Byzantium, until the fall of what became Istanbul.
Yeah.
There were two centers of Christianity. And in fact, if we look at the history, even those two centers, as much as they fought each other, were still united in trying to pretend there weren't, in fact, other centers, because there were centers of Christianity in Ethiopia and in other places as well that had their own, archbishops or bishops of the equivalent of a position of the Bishop of Rome. They used to be peers with each other, not all subordinate to the Pope. And when in the medieval period, the Bishop of Rome found that intolerable, he started to pretend that his peers were not his peers, but were his subordinates. And he was able to subordinate the smaller, places, but he was not able to subordinate the Bishop of Constantinople. And so as a result, there remained a two-way split. There was the Eastern Church and the Western Church all the way through the medieval period.
The Orthodox and the Rome Church were the Western ones, though.
Right, because there were others further east.
Yeah.
The bigger Church of the East,
That's
which
right.
was in the Persian Empire, which eventually sort of was wiped out. But a very different world conception from the European
That's right.
church.
That's right. So go ahead, Sharon.
So in Kenneth Smith's commentary here, how do we meld all of that to take anything forward into the millennium?
Right. So what we see happening is that in the same way that the early Christian church was a brotherhood, a sisterhood, a church of equals who met at each other's houses, and there was no hierarchy. You can see a lot of that in the authentic Paul writings. No hierarchy. And there were traveling preachers who went from household to household, sharing, their visions and sharing their interpretations. That was overthrown by a hierarchical Orthodox church that wanted to wield power structures. And they suppressed the early kind of egalitarian Christian church.
It sounds like the Cathars and the Waldensians. The heretics of the Middle Ages.
This is part of understanding medievalism, is that will to create a unified church went hand in hand with the belief of overthrowing a variety of gods in a polytheistic ancient world who were peers with each other and replacing them with one God who ruled over, originally over humans, but eventually they start inserting saints right in between. They start creating a hierarchy. But if there is going to be a hierarchy, then the middle level still has to be subordinate to the top level. At the top level, there must be one. There's a monism that goes with the monotheism. And the monism, the desire to reduce all things to one, or two, one could be bad and one could be good. It was a constant struggle between the dualist versus monist, in Christianity. This not only happened in the first centuries when they suppressed the house church religion and replaced it with a hierarchical religion that had a permanent clergy. It happened again because the Orthodox Church wasn't strong enough and wasn't united enough to create a single church. So they had different churches. They had a Syrian church, they had an Egyptian church, they had an they had an Ethiopian church, there's the church in Rome. There were all these different dioceses that were co-equal with each other. And they would meet periodically at councils to, establish what the orthodoxy was and disseminate it. But it was fundamentally instead of being a single great hierarchy, it was a forest of hierarchies. It was a bunch of side-by-side churches that were coordinating their orthodoxy. And just like the Orthodox Church of the 2nd and 3rd centuries overthrew the house religion, so during the medieval era, the Church of Rome decided it was not enough, that it could be equal with these others, it had to dominate them. And there became a movement for the Church of Rome to try to get on top of all of them. It wanted a pyramid with a single point at the top, and it wanted to be the point at the top. It wanted the Pope to be that person. So this constant replacement of diversity with orthodoxy, and this constant replacement of egalitarian relations with hierarchical relations, was a theme that happened throughout the medieval era, but also in the ancient era, when the seeds of the medieval era were first arising. This happens over and over at different scales of magnitude, from starting with the individual level and eventually working its way up to, bishops and who's the archbishop.
Could you suggest a work that separates these Paul's writings into what they consider the authentic and inauthentic?
There's a lot of disagreement about which ones are which, but there's also a lot of agreement about some of them. Everybody, pretty much all of the modern scholars agree Timothy isn't legit, and some of the others aren't legit. And you can go through. Is there
a Wikipedia page or something like that covering the controversy?
Well, Wikipedia doesn't want to talk about it because remember, we've got an enormous fundamentalist movement in this country. So you try to say these things too clearly on Wikipedia where anybody can edit, and there'll be a fundamentalist on there like that erasing it and getting rid of it. But you can, if you do some Google searches at like the Jesus Seminar, that was the largest, most recent effort. It lasted about 25 years of biblical scholars and old language experts working together to try to work out which was the authentic and which was which had interpolations or forgeries inserted into it. It's interesting. It's an interesting movement. Generally speaking, one of the clues to watch for is if you understand that the early Christian church was an egalitarian movement, a house religion with traveling faith healers and miracle workers and prophets, any passage that reads like that's probably the real Paul. And sometimes when they interpolate or insert things into his letters, they slip up and they start talking about the clergy. They'll talk about hierarchies. The moment they talk about hierarchies, that's not Paul. There were no hierarchies in Paul's day. That developed 100 to 150 years later as part of the Orthodox movement. So that's one of the things to watch for. The misogyny is another really good thing to watch for. You'll find passages in Paul where he praises this prophetess or that prophetess and says, "I commend you to the care of this prophetess she speaks authentically from God, and you should trust her." Just like anytime you read that, that's Paul. He always writes that stuff. Anytime you read, "Women should be seen and not heard," "Women should not talk in church," any of that stuff, that's 100 years later. That was inserted. That was during the period when they were overthrowing all those. So before I go on and call on Phil, and then we'll go back to the text, one more thing to talk about is a passage I quoted before, but I don't think I fully did justice to it. This book, what you see on the internet is in the links that that David has linked us to, are the articles that Kenneth originally wrote for the Comics Journal. They were like standalone articles as part of a column. But we're working on putting a book together out of this, and Kenneth always had in mind to put a book together out of these articles.
Yes, but we need the other book where the original documents disappear, and we have all these critics denouncing him as a heretic, and then we've got to try and work out who Kenneth Smith is from the denouncers.
Fortunately, he's still alive to tell me what his intentions are, so that helps a lot. So I have various quotes that he wants to put in the early parts of the book, like before the table of contents, and across from the title page, there'll be some quotes. And one of his favorite quotes, I'm just gonna go find this again, is from Gilbert Murray, who I've alluded to a couple of times. The great classicist Gilbert Murray wrote, in the preface, he quotes this, by the way. He says, "What classicist Gilbert Murray wrote before World War I about the modern genius for routinization and mechanical mentality is still astute. The strong governments and orderly societies of modern Europe have made it infinitely easier for men of no particular virtue to live a decent life. Infinitely easier also for men of no particular reasoning power or scientific knowledge to have a more or less scientific or sane view of the world." Now, I'm going to pop that into the quotes here. That's Gilbert Murray, and that's from 5 Stages of Greek Religion.
Well, that's like the establishment of the American nation. It was a very fine-looking ship. It was a beautiful ship, and then its original creators died, and you can get people like Trump and Biden sailing it.
So the reason that I want to take us to this quote is that, as is often the case with quotes by Kenneth Smith, the original context of the quote is even more interesting than the quote itself. And the original context is a discussion that Gilbert Murray has from the time of Augustine about what it was like to live when Augustine was writing, when he was doing that first great work of revisionism and trying to pull together the cosmology and theology of what would become the medieval church. It's just fascinating. I'm gonna pull it up here, and if you guys are willing, I'd like to read this to you a little bit, because I did it a few weeks ago, but I want to do it again. We have a lot of new people here today, and it's directly relevant to this question of the emergence of the medieval era. It gives us an idea of the transformation of the church from the early Christian church to the Orthodox church, because by Augustine's time it was Orthodox. He was coming along after the establishment of the canon and helping to create the coherent theology that would become the cosmology of the medieval epoch. And he knew he was doing that. He knew he was trying to, as Phil said, rationalize what they had so far. And he was doing this in response to the crisis of their success. As the ancient Roman empire is falling away, Christianity is losing its original underdog status, and a lot of its rationalizations are falling apart. And it needs a new framework to explain why it's just as good as a ruling world power as it was as an upstart rebel. So at that time in history, here's what Gilbert Murray has to say about Augustine. It's just a few paragraphs. Points of minor morals, again, are apt to surprise a reader of ancient literature. We must remember, of course, that they always do surprise one, in every age of history, as soon as its manners are studied in detail. One need not go beyond Salimbene's Chronicle. One need hardly go beyond Macaulay's History, or any of the famous French memoirs to realize that. Was it really an ordinary thing in the first century, as Philo seems to say, for gentlemen at dinner parties to black one another's eyes or bite one another's ears off? Or were such practices confined to some smart set? Or was Philo, for his own purposes, using some particular scandalous occurrence as if it was typical? St. Augustine mentions among the virtues of his mother her unusual meekness and tact. Although her husband had a fiery temper, she never had bruises on her face, which made her a rara avis, a rare bird, among the matrons of her circle. Her circle presumably included Christians, as well as pagans and Manichaeans. And Philo's circle can hardly be considered pagan. Indeed, as for the difference of religion, we should bear in mind that just at the time we are about to consider, the middle of the 4th century, the conduct of the Christians, either to the rest of the world or to one another, was very far from evangelical.
Yes.
Ammianus says that no savage beasts could equal its cruelty. Ammianus was a pagan, but St. Gregory himself says it was like hell. I've expressed elsewhere my own general answer to this puzzle. Not only in early Greek times, but throughout the whole of antiquity, the possibility of all sorts of absurd and atrocious things lay much nearer. The protective forces of society were much weaker. The strain on personal character, the need for real wisdom and virtue, was much greater than it is at the present day. That is one of the causes that makes antiquity so interesting. Of course, different periods of antiquity varied greatly, both in the conventional standard demanded and in the spiritual force which answered or surpassed the demand. But in general, the strong governments and orderly societies of modern Europe have made it infinitely easier for men of no particular virtue to live a decent life, infinitely easier also for men of no particular reasoning power or scientific knowledge to have a more or less scientific or sane view of the world. That, however, does not carry us far towards solving the main problem. It brings us no nearer to knowledge of anything that we may call typically a religious creed or an authorized code of morals, in any age, from Hesiod to Marcus Aurelius. He's saying that by the time of Augustine's age, Christianity had changed so much that the early house church that used to attract women in droves because they were given respect and kindness had turned into a kind of patriarchal brutality in which men beat their wives so often that anytime you called a dinner party, the women would show up with split lips and bruises on their faces. And that Augustine's mother had to be a paragon of meekness to live with a man who had a fiery temper and still didn't beat her. He said, he's basically saying she must have been godly in her meekness, just divine, to avoid from this raging temper of a man what even the ordinary men did to their wives all the time. They were beating their wives all the time. Not just in the pagan world, but in the Christian world. So we know when we read Paul and we compare what we see in Paul to what we see later from the Orthodox Church, that what has happened here, this is even before the fall of Rome, before the medieval era is fully underway. There has been a revolution within the Christian church. And the early church that was so welcoming to women has been replaced by a misogynist church. And we know that in between Augustine's time and the time of Paul is when people started forging letters like Timothy and inserting lines into Paul to try to undo his generosity to women, his kindness to women, his respect for women, because by 100 years after Paul, they didn't feel that way anymore. They wanted women in their place, and they wanted them to shut up. The important thing about this is that this is not, neither Gilbert Murray nor Kenneth Smith nor I am taking information out of context to attempt to paint them as looking bad. If you look at the next 1,000 years of writings from medieval writers, you'll find an inordinate amount of writing about the sinfulness of women, the wickedness of women. They hated women because of Eve. They blamed them for everything. They blamed them for death. They blamed them for hell. And they felt like, if you're a man, it's a tough world because you got men above you, and some of them might not be godly and they might be cruel. And even if you do the best you can, you may have to suffer through this life before you get to go to heaven, but at least you can hit your wife, right? At least there's somebody that you can put in their place. This was a mainstay of the medieval church. Now, this is happening side by side with movements that are trying to get away from that, right? The movement of women mystics, abbesses, and nuns. This was one of the main places where women who didn't want to be beat on and wanted to be treated with respect, they tried to arrange their lives in such a way that they could end up in a nunnery or as an abbess, or in some way pull out of this cruel patriarchal culture and go someplace where Christianity, the premises that Jesus preached about, were extended to women as well as to men, where women were not merely granted occasionally not being hitted by some man, but could actually be leaders, could actually be visionaries, could be healers, could be prophets. Some of Paul's vision for what a woman could be in the Christian church was sort of kept alive in these nunneries and abbeys at the exact same time that elsewhere in the mainstream of the medieval church, they were being beaten on. So this is part of understanding the medieval era. There's a reason why all the witch hunting happened. Any uppity woman would get accused of being a witch. There's a reason why that happened, because they were considered the rightful prey of angry men, frustrated men who needed to take out their anger on somebody. There is a cruelty that got imported into the Christian religion during the time when it was converted from a church religion to an Orthodox religion. And that cruelty, the timing of that cruelty, if you look at it having been achieved by the time of Augustine, and Augustine is writing in the late Roman Empire, what you see happening is that there are dinner parties where there are pagan men who beat their wives and Christian men who beat their wives, and they could sit around the same table and nobody's mocking the other one because they're out of sync with each other. The Orthodox Christian church synced up with the dominant misogyny of the late Roman Empire in order to be compatible. And that was part of the process of becoming the state religion. They had to do that. If they hadn't done that, they would have been continued to be mocked, continued to be ostracized. They never would have had a shot at becoming the Roman religion. But by doing that, they made themselves compatible. Even though it involved turning the early Christianity entirely upside down, replacing the love and respect with cruelty would seem to be an anti-Christian religion. But that's what they had to do in order to rise to power. And this is what I mean when I talk about the way that whenever an epoch successfully revolts against the previous epoch, there is an enormous array of philosophical, cosmological, theological, ethical things that it rejects and says, those things were evil and we will not do those things. We are not like those people. And we're going to list for you all the ways in which we're different. And we're going to escape. By the way, anytime we screw up in a way that's not consistent with our own ethos, we'll scapegoat those guys because you all know they're bad and we're the good ones. There is this whole negation that Hegel talks about a lot as being part and parcel of the process of the blossom separating itself from the bud. But at the same time, the only way it was able to rise to power was by harmonizing with part of the previous epoch. It had to do both at the same time. It had to be in opposition and in harmony so that when it pushed off, there are certain things that were left behind and there were certain things that were carried forward. And when we're trying to understand Hegel's philosophy of history, when we're trying to understand the structure of the dialectic and why these epochs are not arbitrary, they're real things, and why the struggles, the revolutions between one era and another are real things, you can't find a better example than to watch the way that the Orthodox Church completely inverted Christianity's values towards women in order to cozy up to the Roman Empire, to rise to power, to be able to overthrow the Roman Empire. And when it overthrew the empire, it got rid of plenty of other things, but it kept the misogyny. And it stayed an issue. One other quick thing before I call on Phil. The other thing is these revolutions are never 100% successful. Even the things that you tried to throw behind you, some of it you carry forward. It wasn't until in the industrial era that we had the ability to mass produce mines. So there was always, throughout the medieval period, a huge problem with heresies and splinter groups. Like Stephen mentioned the Albigensians earlier, I believe. And there were a lot of these splinter groups, the Hussites and so on, who were like, why can't we all just be like Jesus? Why do we have to do all these things the hierarchy tells us to do? Why can't we just listen to the Sermon on the Mount, listen to the, some of the core values, and why can't we just behave like that? And of course, that was a heresy, right? The belief that you can cultivate your own character, that you can save yourself, was a heresy in the medieval church. The only salvation...
You can't have your own opinions. That's what the word heresy means.
Exactly.
Opinions.
Exactly. The whole point, the whole premise, the most important thing about the medieval era is that it was going to solve the problem of ancient corruption by taking salvation out of the hands of human beings who had proven themselves to be so corruptible as to generate the late Roman Empire, and to put it all in the hands of God, who's pure and perfect and all-powerful. And they believed it was the only way to escape the trap of corruption.
Especially women.
Well, and that's the thing, in the early Christian church, the women weren't being scapegoated. But by the time the Christianity becomes the dominant power and overthrows Rome, women are being scapegoated again. The inversion occurs as part of that. So, but this is the thing, that the forces at work on a cultural movement that is on its way to overthrowing a previous cultural movement are so powerful that it will turn itself inside out and even become the opposite of itself in order to survive the transformation and become a dominant power. You see moderns all the time talking about revolution as though it's something they could easily do. We just get enough guns, we'll shoot the bad guys and we'll win and we'll have a revolution. But what you see happening from the transformation to early Christianity to Orthodox Christianity goes well beyond just picking up some guns and shooting the Romans. They themselves are transforming to an extent unimaginable and still to this day almost inconceivable. Almost no Christian churches today read these passages from Augustine. And if they do, they're careful to shift the focus somewhere else, because nobody wants to say that in the 300s, the Orthodox Christian church was unbelievably cruel to women. They don't want to say it. It just doesn't fit with the picture of, Jesus is a prophet of love. He's telling us to love one another. and we are the religion that follows him. You just can't reconcile these things. And so certain information had to be suppressed. For the information to be suppressed, the Bible had to be taken out of the hands of everyday people and kept into a small group, and they would be careful about which parts of it they read at which times to make sure that you never reach the wrong conclusions. There is a reason why dogmatism goes hand in hand with orthodoxy. They had to. It was the only way to make this work. So, Phil, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute.
Oh,
there you go.
My video, my internet connection keep going on and off, so that's why I had to go on and off.
Sure.
And anyway, even by the 4th century, remember the barbarians were at the gates.
Oh yes.
And although
they were in the cities,
yeah,
they were being hired as mercenaries.
That's right. So like early Christianity was more egalitarian, that's for sure, and there was many centers. But by the 4th century, certainly there already was established a kind of duopoly between Constantinople and Rome. It probably should have moved to Constantinople, but Rome was the old Rome, the imperial Rome. So, the new Rome had to kind of give allegiance to it. So there was kind of a polar relationships. And the West, particularly the Western part of Rome, was being constantly attacked by the Vandals, by the Goths, by the Franks, like the Huns and so forth. It was really falling apart, much more than Constantinople, although they had their troubles too. They had to bargain with the Goths in particular. And so as a result, there was a dependency that was related between the nobilities of Rome and the church, that they needed each other.
Right.
And they created a merger in a way, in order to protect itself. And so in a sense, they needed the physical protection of the old Rome and the kind of spiritual movement that moves into the hinterlands, which was form of the colonies, in order to, in a sense, tame the barbarians and translate it into whatever. So I think that merger, in a sense, compromised it, but they had to, otherwise it would just be overrun by the Vandals and the Goths, and it would cease to exist. Okay,
that's right.
So therefore, that was a necessity. No matter how much you wanted the new kingdom to come, it's not going to come without some support in the old kingdom. You want to call it that way. And so maybe if it has shifted to Constantinople, they could have consolidated power and continue to exist, but they didn't. So as a result, that's what made and it wasn't really finally consolidated in the Roman poly until maybe Charlemagne, when he, united, in a sense, the Franks, and with the Pope, and created in a sense that the new Roman Empire, and so in that sense, I don't know. So it took a long time for that merger to actually consolidate. So between the 4th century until what, Charlemagne was like the 8th century, 9th century. And so there was a long period of integration, of slowly merging together in order to maintain the power on earth, to maintain the power of the church, and in a sense, the spiritual power. So I think not enough attention is paid to that merger that took place. And so therefore compromises have to be made. So the pure religious people would not like the compromises, but that was a necessity, if you're not going to go under altogether. So the problem is, when you acquire power, you have to exercise power. That's the problem.
It's when we eventually cover China, it's part of what's going to be really interesting in the comparison and contrast. I'm going to keep going back to China over and over on this, because just like China unified at the beginning of the feudal period and stayed more or less unified. They might split, but they always knew they were only one step away from going back together. Whereas Europe never was together. Even during the Roman Empire, there were always barbarians fighting against. And the moment the Christians were in charge, everything started to fall apart. And it wasn't their fault. It's just that the whole medieval epoch was about the sense of loss and fragmentation and the struggle for a dream of unity that in China had been achieved at the beginning of the periods that Europe never achieved. And what's interesting is that hand in hand with that political fragmentation, there is a theological fragmentation. Because by the time the medieval revolution succeeds, by the time Christianity becomes the Roman religion and the Constantine Byzantine religion, we have already gone through such a period of suppressing alternative perspectives that there's an enormous amount of anger within the Christian community. Many Christians don't like the Christian orthodoxy. Many house churches continue to exist in secret. And the more that the orthodoxy cracks down on them, the angrier they get at the orthodoxy. Like right out of the gate, right at the beginning of the medieval era, there are already people who are like, I don't buy half of what you guys are saying. I just want to do what Jesus tells us to do. And that idea keeps cropping up over and over under different names all throughout the period. So even from the very beginning, Orthodox Christianity has a problem with heresy. And it isn't just solved by suppression, although that is a major feature of the medieval epoch, is military attacks against Christians in order to make them stop believing the things that the Orthodoxy don't want them to believe. But on top of that, it was too powerful. It was the centrifugal force away from the center was too strong. And so they had to set up monastic movements. They had to say, well, we're not going to do what you say, but I can see that if we ignore you or try to stop you, everything will fall apart. So why don't we make a special group just for you guys? Or just for you ladies, you can have your nunnery. Or just for you, everybody got spun off some little sect area where they could live according to a code that was different from the orthodoxy, but that the orthodoxy blessed, but only for you guys, as an attempt to somehow say we're still one religion, even though if I hadn't given you this, we would have all fallen apart because I couldn't stop you, and yet I couldn't let you do it either. There are internal contradictions. We're just spinning out of them at the very beginning. If you go back and look at the earliest stages of the movement of hermits, the Eremite movements and so on, you see that many of them predate the medieval era. Some of them get started, before we've even got into the medieval era. Literally flying out of the gate comes the horse and 18 other horses. And they're all saying, we're one horse. And everyone's going, are we now? It's like, I'm not sure any of you agree on anything, but we're going to say that we're one horse, even though we actually disagree fundamentally and very deeply over an enormous array of things.
Yeah, but China had the advantage of the Hans was such a dominant population as well as a culture that there was minorities, no doubt, that it was big enough to suppress them. And they even have like autonomous zones in a sense, as what you say, right? Whereas Europe was always full of many different people. So the Huns didn't get along with the Vandals, didn't get along with the Goths. I mean, it's like so it was more difficult to unify because of such diversity. Whereas the Chinese, the Han was so dominant in terms of not only the culture but the population that, in a sense, these subcultures, although they existed and they were rebellious, but nonetheless they were always overcome either by power or by the sheer numbers of people. So
we're going to talk about that a lot in the weeks to come. Sure. But one thing to include in this also is, and this is kind of the point I'm going at, is in early Orthodox Christianity, after the early period when the Orthodoxy was coming together, their theology wasn't coherent. They were still arguing about the nature of the Trinity right up until, the time of the formation of the canon. How to read these books and what to think that they meant was not a settled matter, even at the point where they're trying to lock down the books and say no more changes. And the moment you set in motion an orthodox structure, It means that you are now insisting on a rigidity. You're saying all the answers are predetermined. You can reason any way you want as long as you come to these answers. But the problem is the answers haven't been well thought out. They're right, because we're coming out of a period of ferocious infighting and struggling. And our focus was on beating the other movements, like putting down the Gnostics and, putting down all these different groups. That was their focus. When they suddenly had won, they were also stuck with the answers that they had cobbled together during that period, even the ones that didn't make sense. And so from there on out, the Orthodox theology has to put this enormous superstructure of beliefs and practices in place that isn't anywhere to be found in the Bible. And they have to do that because they didn't get it figured out of the gate. They came flying out of the gate. It wasn't just 17 other horses from different movements. Even their own central movement was a bunch of horses. Yeah. It's like there really wasn't any unity. By contrast, when Neo-Confucianism developed, they didn't just suppress Moism. For those who don't know about Moism, it is one of the most important movements in Chinese philosophical history to know about, because the orthodox line on Christianity is that it's the only religion that ever preached love. And if you read the Moists, you will be amazed to find them preaching love and kindness and compassion. And the Moists almost spelled the end of Confucianism, because Confucianism in its first form was rigid and orthodox and cruel. And people were flocking to the Moists and the Taoists and the Buddhists, saying anything's better than you guys. But what made feudal China work is that they reinvented Confucianism as Neo-Confucianism, pulling in elements of Buddhism, elements of Taoism, but above all, elements of Moism. Under Neo-Confucianism, you could not be a good Confucian if you were cruel to your family, if you were cruel to women, if you were cruel to the stranger or your neighbors. All the things we think of as Christianity, a lot of that in a very different Chinese form got pulled into the new Confucianism. And so as a result, it was more resilient, right? It was where the Orthodox Christianity of medieval Europe was pissing off everybody every time it acted through its insistence on rigidity and dogma and cruelty. Neo-Confucianism had a lot of give and take. It's not that it didn't have cruelty, but it's as though if we could imagine sometime in the 700s or 800s, if we could imagine that the Orthodox said, well, what we came out of the gate with was just a rough draft. Let's go back and pull more of Jesus's sayings in, and the Sermon on the Mount and some of those. Let's make those central to the orthodoxy. They would have been a very different religion going into the rest of the medieval period. And they wouldn't have had half the problem they did with splinter movements saying, but you're not acting like Jesus and I want to be like Jesus. If they'd said, let's all be like Jesus and all the orthodox stuff, they would have held together the way that the Neo-Confucianists did in China, in exactly the way that the Christians did not in Europe. It was the early success locked in place a rough draft of the theology that was incoherent and cruel. And then they were stuck with it and had to rationalize it for the next 1,000 years. And ultimately, that's what led to the Protestant Reformation and the rise of modernism. They couldn't get out from under the contradictions and cruelty and corruption that they built in from the beginning. By ignoring Jesus's stuff, by focusing on what it took to become an empire, they made themselves an undesirable religion, and they had to impose it by force, which is where Charlemagne comes in. So before I call on Sharon, just one last thing. If you don't know any other dates from the medieval era, the most important date to know is Christmas of 800, Christmas Day of 800, December 25th. That is when the Pope crowned Charlemagne. And that was the first perfect statement of the medieval recipe. God is in charge. God's agents speak for God, and they give secular power to rulers. And the purpose of those rulers is to carry out God's will on earth. So Charlemagne traveled throughout Europe, committing genocide against all the indigenous religions, all the pagans and heathens. He burned down the sacred groves. He murdered people left and right. He left a wasteland, just like the Romans had done. He learned the lessons. He took all the lessons of how Rome did its empire, and he swept across Europe killing. Anybody who would convert, he'd let them live. But if they wouldn't convert, he murdered them. And he was able to become the first Holy Roman Emperor, serving under the auspices of the Pope in return for helping to unify Europe underneath Orthodox Christianity. That became the recipe for the rest of the medieval era. That was what they wanted. They wanted to do that again and again and again.
There's a point there that they say that Charlemagne's activities were what caused the Vikings to suddenly jump up.
Oh, sure.
Who feared for their pagan religion.
Yeah, that's right.
When you saw all these other pagans getting the chop,
Yeah.
the ones in Scandinavia started thinking, oh, we're next. We have to fight back.
And they said so. There are numerous places where the pagans said, well, of course, we preferentially sack churches because you guys said convert or die, and we don't want to convert or die. So we have a different option. How about you die? So they went all over Europe sacking churches, stealing all their gold and money, right? The Vikings, I think you're right, Stephen, were exactly a pagan response to Charlemagne's cruelty and success. And of course, again, I'm not trying to, this is why it's so important to distinguish Christianity from medievalism. Because at the same time all this horrific stuff is going on, there are, in monasteries, there are monks and nuns here and there who are writing their little treatises going, what if we loved each other? What if we were nice to each other? What if we weren't so cruel to each other? And they're existing exactly as a counter movement to the dominant orthodoxy of the medieval era. And they're keeping alive some of the ideas that are going to emerge around the time of the Protestant Reformation, as when they finally feel like it's safe to burst out and say, you know what, I've had it with all this corruption. We are definitely going to try to be more like Jesus. Even if you call us heretics, we don't care. We'll break with your church. We'll make our own Christian churches and we'll be more like Jesus. This whole spinoff, had been simmering for the whole 1,000 years. Sharon, you got your hand up. You want to? Oh, I called on you just as you stepped away. How cruel. All right, she'll come back and there she is. Hi, Sharon. We got to bring you off mute there.
I apologize for that. Something that's always fascinated me is that as Christianity evolved, I think, and even though there was dissent among the early Christians about the theology, I think it adopted certain ideas from the culture around it. Like the virgin birth is not unique to Christianity.
That's right.
Neither is the Trinity.
Right.
That came from Hinduism. The virgin birth happened a lot of times in Egyptian mythology.
Right.
Right. So that was part of the conflict. That's one thing. And the second thing, I liked what Kenneth Smith said here, back to the text.
Yeah. Please.
As he summed it up, he said, the tides of history and human actions were once a brute fact, the working out of a profound natural logic, unimpeachable in its stoic reality. Now, a Christian metaphysical regime induces us to expect rational moral justice from the world. Yes. And I think that's with the emergence of Charlemagne, right? There is a rational why now, where before the fates could only mutely display the weave of lives into an epic pattern.
That's right.
So that I think kind of sums up what you were saying, right? And the other thing that's fascinated me, and this is a kind of a subculture, and it has to do a little bit with misogyny. As Christianity evolved in the Middle Ages, it had a lot to do with the building of churches, because churches pertain many functions in society. I think they educated, they provided care, they provided food. And so there was a lot of significant building going on. And a secret society evolved, which has always fascinated me, the Masons, the Freemasons. Extremely misogynistic. Right? That was a male dominant society. And I couldn't find a lot of it written about, but they played a significant role in the culture.
They did. Yes. They did. That's right. Yeah, in fact, it's part of the trace of the medieval epoch is that the early success of orthodoxy and its rising success set in motion most of its problems. But among its problems that it was unhappy with are things that we were happy with. So the rise of these movements that said, what if instead of just following the orthodoxy, what if we're kind to each other? What if we're good to each other? What if we love one another? They started out on the fringes, getting killed and burned and co-opted, or sometimes being allowed to be in monasteries or nunneries. But eventually it began to arise within the mainstream churches themselves. There became this movement of the common folk to say, well, I don't know about all this stuff you talk about, but the parts where you're talking about being kind, we can relate to that. And so we're going to convert for that reason, and we're going to engage in those practices. Every time you try to push us into the other stuff, yeah, our cooperation will be weak. We'll be like water. You'll be like trying to fight water. But every time that you quote Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, we're all going to show up, and we're all going to be rooting for you. And what happened was this generational turnover, right? Where the people who had succeeded early on through their cruelty, their descendants, could only get so far that way. And the movement began to splinter. Christianity became a layered religion in which there was a folk religion underneath that increasingly got more and more focused on the Sermon on the Mount. And on top of it was this orthodoxy that became split within itself about which part of, were you going to be the Orthodox part, or were you going to be the Jesus part? And there became these struggles for control within the hierarchy up above about which was it going to be. And eventually it became such that even if you were the most ruthless, psychopathic, genocidal monster who only thought about power, you had to put on a mask of kindness. You could no longer be the kind of early saint who was like, I wiped out all of the population of Transylvania, and now Christians can move in, and therefore I'm a saint. That just didn't stop happening. You were not allowed anymore to rise to power by being nakedly cruel. You had to at least say the right things in public, go along with the people around you, because the new political correctness was to be more like Jesus and less like a genocidal maniac. It became, and that's important, right? As much as people complain about political correctness today, frequently what they mean is, how come I can't just, call women bitches and call, black people this, and why can't I just do this, that, and the other? It's mean that when I do those things, now people scowl at me, whereas, my dad used to get praised for that. Why do I have to be kind? Why do I have to care about people's feelings? This was happening in the medieval era, when the earlier generations of, just straight up, I'll just slaughter everybody who disagrees with me, were gradually losing power and being replaced by people who, even if they wanted to engage in those practices, they had to stop talking that way. They had to start acting loving. They had to learn the language of how to pass in a denomination where all of the people who follow you expect you to behave differently than that. They expect more loving behavior. And so it's not that by the end of the medieval period, the medieval church was, a paragon of kindness. It's that it was a radically different church than it had been at the beginning of the period. The movement to be more like Jesus was a very strong movement. And that's why the Protestant Reformation exploded out of it, right? Because there was enormous held back momentum to go back to the roots of Christianity and to say, it's not worth it to be a world spanning empire if the price of doing that is to betray everything that Jesus stood for. It's just not okay. It's not worth it, right? And so you saw this explosion. It's why in modern Christianity, along with all the other flavors you get a lot of churches whose central theses are, you got to be kind, you got to be loving, you got to be good to each other. At the beginning of the medieval era, there weren't a lot of churches that was their central thesis.
Okay, I'm going to give up on the Bible and go back to the secret history of the Mongols.
So is that better though in a way, because like it just means it just shifted to hypocrisy rather than, at least they were honest. We're gonna go kill you, right? I mean, like I actually don't know which is worse, to tell you the truth.
Well, it's not that everybody became hypocrites. It's that it became a split between people who were hypocrites and people who authentically wanted to embody love.
No, that's true. But what I'm saying is the church itself have to then do the cover up in a way, right? It's like while during the early period, it was saying, look, we want power. We needed the power for us to do it. It's a little bit like Hitler saying, we need to have Russia so we could expand the German people, right? I mean, it's like that. I mean, if nothing else, he was at least honest about that.
Well, so here's the thing. That kind of honesty is overrated.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why. Because the thing about that kind of honesty is he knows he doesn't have to be afraid. He knows he can get away with being that way.
Yeah.
The point at which people start to become crypto-genocidal is the stage, or crypto-racist or crypto-misogynist, is the stage at which they understand they can't get away with it openly anymore.
Yeah.
That the tide has turned, the ship has sailed, and they're in the minority now. And they're going to have to, if they want to keep behaving badly, they now have to do it secretly. And it's a sign of the end stage before that thing dies out completely. Is I find a way to keep doing the wrong thing, but I do it under the cover of pretending to do the right thing. Right? This is a huge step forward from let's just kill all the Indians and everybody agrees. If we go from 1492 to today, even the hypocrites who still hate Indians are much better people than Christopher Columbus was, because he's just like, not only do I hate Indians, I'm just going to say it, and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to chop all their hands and feet off and make them slaves, and nobody can stop me. Haha, I win. That's a terrible state of affairs. Nobody wants that. The point at which they're like, now nobody likes me if I do those things or even say I want to do those things, so I have to pretend to like them, and I can only tell my racist jokes in a locker room and nobody else is around. This is huge progress. That's what you want to see, right? It's horrible. We wish people would just be convinced to do the right thing, but that's just not how it goes. They have to be worn down, right? There's always going to be a hardcore that gets too excited by domination and coercion, and those people have to be worn down. Other people may convert out of kindness or having an epiphany or enlightenment, but the hardcore are never going to do it, and they just have to understand that they're unwelcome behaving that way anymore. So this is what happened over the course of the medieval epoch. And so as a result, the rise of hypocrisy was necessitated by the need to pretend that you're as nice as the people that your flock is. The people around you expect better behavior than you're capable of doing, so you become a hypocrite. And now instead of complaining about how openly cruel you are, like Augustine was complaining about the emperors, now we're complaining about the fact that you say you're not cruel, but look at you engaging in cruel behavior. And hypocrisy was the last stage before the fall of the medieval era. It was the rise of the hypocrisy, the mismatch between the mask and the behavior, that ultimately led to the overthrow of the power of the church at the end of the medieval period. And of course, I mean the medieval church, not churches in general. So we sketched out some things. I'm going to call on Sharon, and then I would like to get us through a few themes that are in this. I think we can wrap up this medieval summary today, and next week move on to the modern summary. This won't be the last time in this book we talk about medievalism, because he's got whole chapters about it later. This first chapter is really just giving a sketch of the three sections of the book. So we're going to talk about the ancient perspective and how different that is from the other two. We're going to talk about the medieval perspective and how different it is, and we're going to talk about the modern perspective. But before we can go on to the main section of the book, we got to get through the summary. So I have I don't know if we'll get through it today or not. I have about 5 core observations about ways in which the medieval ideas of soul and spirit and free will and other things are inversions of, and at the same time continuations of, the ancient perspectives that I think will help us to see the logic that unfurled. So Sharon, go ahead first. You had your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to listen to what you had to say, because that was going to be my question. Because
okay.
Even though we're moving from one epoch to the other, as you just said, the medieval era has some inversions, because I think there's some elements that as we go from one epoch to the other, they build on it. They don't completely abandon it. They build on it and take it along. And that's why I asked about the Freemasons, because the Freemasons started in the medieval period and they still exist today.
That's right. That's
right. And so that's why that is such a fascinating subject to me.
They are.
Yes, because they are male dominated. They don't let any women in. And that gets me curious immediately, right?
The Catholic Church is equally fascinating. Its history is equally fascinating, because in some ways it is a continuation of the medieval church. And in other ways, it's fundamentally different from the medieval church. So different that there are splinter movements against the modern Catholic Church that think that it's too progressive, and they want to return to the old reactionary days of, killing people you disagree with. And, there was a cardinal who's on record as saying the church did the right thing to Galileo. He's like, I know we think it's wrong from a modern perspective, but if you look at what the rules are, the church did the right thing. They had to suppress Galileo. And see, that guy's a splinter group, right? That's no longer the dominant position. But, the church has moved from where it was. And it's pissing off some people who wish that it would go backwards. And they dream for the old glory days of medievalism. They don't like modern churches. They don't want the Catholic Church to change. It's like anytime you get a change, you're going to get splinter movements of people who won't go along with you. So it's just like the Masons. The Catholic Church is another institution that has carried forward through the transition, and as a result, it's had to transform to become at least partially a modernist institution.
The other thing that I wanted to say before we move on is that the medieval church had to struggle with the two different theologies of the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the Old Testament, God said to the Jews, that's Jericho. You go march around 7 times, the wall's going to fall down. You go in, you kill all the men, you take all the women. And then Jesus came and he taught kindness. And so the church had to come up with a kind of syncretism for that in the medieval period. And that's where a lot of the discord came from.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, we are definitely going to spend some time talking about the relations between Jews and Christians as we go through this book.
Yeah,
it's fascinating stuff. In the same way, and all I'm going to say about it before we turn to our kind of topics to close out today is that in the same way that the Jews looked at Jesus and said, that's not our Messiah, by the 100s and 200s, Christians were looking at the Jews and saying, you're not really Jews. We're the real Jews because we did what God wanted and you turned away. Therefore, you're all heretics and you're all evil. And we're the only good ones. The reason they call it the Old Testament is because they said it's not your book anymore. It's not the Torah. It's our book. We have two testaments. Your book is now our book, and we're the real you, and you aren't anybody. You're just wrong. And part of what they did in the creation of the Gospels, part of what's interpolated into the Gospels is all the parts that try to say the purpose of the Old Testament exists only to prophesy the coming of Jesus. And so all over the Old Testament, they found passages, and then they inserted them into the Gospels to say, and Jesus did this as was prophesied. And they mean, if you go back to the Old Testament, you can find a passage that can be, if you squint and blink and shake it a lot and get the right light, you could imagine that it's about Jesus and not about what it was actually about when they wrote it. Now, there's a lot of things that Christians say are prophecy in the Old Testament that have nothing to do with Jesus. They're talking about, David in some battle against somebody, or this is Saul fighting against someone, and that's what they were about. But that didn't stop the people in the first century from going back and saying, we're going to prove that it's not that it's not the old Jewish book. We're going to prove it's our book by showing that everything that you think is sacred in there is actually about our sacred things. It's actually about Jesus. It's not about your stuff. So it's not your book. So there we win. And literally, that was the argument in the first and second centuries. And you can see the places where in the Gospels and occasionally in the letters, they're slipping in little references to say, this passage of Isaiah is actually about Jesus, and this passage
Isaiah and Jeremiah, those two books.
Yep. This passage of Jeremiah, but they're not afraid to grab anything. They're like literally all over the Old Testament. They're like, and I know that you think it's about Moses, but that's about Jesus too, and this is Jesus, and that's Jesus, and therefore it's the Old Testament because really it's all about Jesus. This was all the things about Jesus before he was here, and this is all the things written about Jesus after he was here, and that's why they call it the Old and the New Testament. That's why the Orthodox people called it the Old and the New Testament. And it's one of the ways in which the medieval church is different from the modern church. Right? The modern churches understand that it's a Jewish book that we're sharing with the Jews, and it's not our book and they don't get to have it anymore because it's all about Jesus. That was a very medieval conception of the Old Testament that sort of fell by the wayside. In fact, it's hard for us to fully grok how seriously the medievals took that there is no book for the people we call the Jews. It's not theirs anymore. We took it. It's really our book. They had a very different feel about that than we do. It's part of why they're not moderns. So anyway, let's see if we can hit some of these themes. In the first paragraph of Medieval, he talks about, and it's in one of the opening sentences too, it says the gods of the ancients had been themselves subject to the overpowering order of nature, of birth, lust, natural character, and all the other vices that proto-Christian Plato reviled them for. And of course, I have to step in here and say, if Donald was here, he would say, don't blame Plato for this. Yes, we know, Donald, we're right. But this is how the medievals reinterpreted Plato. Christianity, for the first time, conceived a God obligated to be holy or transcendent over such natural flux. In other words, our God's better than your God because your gods are subject to nature and our God isn't. Our God's immune to all of that. In fact, he made all of that. None of, anything that you think was holy is actually just a creation of our God. Our God's better than your God. This was part of the medieval, this was how they won over a lot of people in the ancient world. As they said, we know you're a hierarchical people. We know you want whatever is the best or the highest. Well, our God is the highest because he made all the things that your gods are subject to. So your gods aren't really gods. Our God's the only real God. But in doing that, in order to make that argument, they set in motion something they didn't intend, which is a spiritual God, radically self-empowered, who made the world to be utterly his artificial contrivance, his logos or system of order. So through the ancient world, the focus of everything good was natural in some way. You were trying to harmonize with the best of nature. That was how you succeeded, right? You were, and this is actually really hard for moderns to understand. So we're 2 steps removed from this worldview. We really can't quite grok it. The ancient worldview, religion was not something demanded of people. It was something people naturally had, because the things you were telling them to respect, you weren't telling them to worship in any way that we would understand. We think of worship from a Christian context. Even atheists think of gods and worship from a Christian context. It's heavily colored by the medieval cosmology. But the important thing to understand about it is, from the medieval perspective, it's the artifice. The reason that you obey is not because it's natural to obey, but because it is unnatural to obey. We're going to postulate a God who makes no sense, and you're going to believe in him anyway. And when we say no sense, we mean all the framework you use for making sense of things from the natural world, it's all just creations. It might even be lies. And if you think that a tree means something, or if you think birth and death means something, if you think any of these things mean things, you're a heretic. The only thing that means things is God. Only God means things. This is the purified form of the Hebrew religion. God is omniscient. God is omnipotent. God is the source of all meaning. Nothing natural has any meaning. And therefore, if you want to be good, you have to behave unnaturally. You have to do the things that don't come naturally to you. So we say, how could ancient religion worship Aphrodite? I mean, yeah, sure, beauty's nice and sex is nice, but is it sacred? Isn't it just nice? And of course, from the ancient perspective, anything that has authority, anything that actually naturally has authority over us is divine. Not because we tell you it's divine and force you to believe it, but because anybody can look around and see the way that people are swayed by beauty and attraction. That is to say, rather than asserting that it has authority over us, anyone can see that it does. You don't worship Poseidon because otherwise Poseidon will hurt you. You worship him because he's the damn ocean. Look, it's right there. How can you disbelieve in the ocean? It's an ocean. And if you sail out on it in disregard to the way the ocean behaves, it's going to kill you. And it's not going to kill you because you refuse to believe in it. It's going to kill you because it's real. Faith is not an act of overcoming. Faith in the ancient world is not an act of asserting your will to believe. You don't have to force yourself to believe in the ancient gods, because the ancient gods are nature itself, and any idiot can see it's there, right? Vegetation in the spring, all the plants come up. If you disbelieve that the plants come up, what are you, an idiot? Of course the plants come up. That's a sacred thing happening because it keeps happening whether we want it to or not. You don't have to have faith in it. It just happens anyway. The notion of faith as an artifice, as something deliberately, egotistically imposed upon people, as a test that they have to prove that they have faith and they have to struggle to have faith, is a medieval concept. It is absolutely not ancient at all. The ancient gods were obviously real because nature is obviously real. And the reason they had authority over us is because The same reason the truck barreling down on you in the freeway has authority on you. If you ignore it, it runs you over. You don't have to believe it will run you over. It will actually run you over. So the ancient gods were not, it wasn't people saying, we want you to bow down and praise this God and flatter him so that he won't beat you and send you to hell. It's the ocean. If you ignore it, you're going to get in trouble, especially if you go out in a boat on it. If you want to sail a boat in the ocean, you really better pay attention to Poseidon, because otherwise you might not come home at night. Not because you will be damned to eternity where you will be tortured, and trust us when we tell you this, but because anybody can see that people who ignore the ocean and go out in boats end up dying in storms or crashing on rocks. It just happens. It's just the way the world works. Faith and religion in the ancient worldview were natural things because they were lawful, real things that anybody can sense. And faith, as a result, was a naive response, not a cultivated intellectual response. It wasn't a struggle to believe. In fact, it would have been a struggle to disbelieve. I define this ocean as not existing. Well, that's going to take some doing. Now you're in the realm of medievalism, believing that things aren't real that you can see with your own eyes, and believing that things are real that you can't see with your own eyes is a complete inversion of the nature of religion itself. So when we say the medieval religion is a revolution against the ancient religion, we mean literally it has turned the entire notion of faith in gods inside out. Mm-hmm. It is now the exact opposite of what it was in the ancient world. It's not just different. You're not just picking off a menu. It's the opposite. It is a rejection of everything that came before. And it had to be a rejection because that's how it won the fight. It said all your gods are wrong, all of them. Only our God is right. And we can prove it to you because the nature of divinity is this. And according to our definition, your stuff is that's just rain falling and waves crashing. None of that's sacred. You would have to be above nature and before nature and beyond nature and all powerful to be worthy of worship. And our God is, and yours is.
The question of certainty as well.
And certainty.
I mean, if you have an absolute all-powerful God, that's pretty certain.
Pretty straightforward. Right. And it's simpler. Right? You no longer have to struggle to think, well, Ares wants me to do this, but Athena wants me to do that. Ares and Athena don't get along, but they're both gods, and I'm stuck in the middle. That doesn't sound nice. I mean, which set of code am I supposed to follow? And of course, what the ancient said is, yes, that's the human problem. We're caught by all these forces that don't care that we're caught in the middle, and it makes life difficult. And medievalism came along and said, no. That's just too messy. That's too complicated. It's really simple. There's only one God. He's told you what to do. Do that and you're saved. Don't do it and you're tortured for eternity, but do it and you're saved. Well, it was a straightforward, simple, understandable religion that made a person's role in the world comprehensible and easy to follow in a way that the ancient religion asked us to grow up and deal with a complex world. There's a reason. Sorry, go ahead, Jeannie.
So Jesus told us what to do, but that those told us what to do came from the Bible,
right?
Only, right? Bible only.
Right,
so
the canon was a critical part of the medieval religion. Here's the instructions. I know they're in a writing system you can't read, but that's okay. We'll tell you what it says.
And they didn't think about the fact that Bible was written by other human beings, or the stories that was handed down.
God, right?
It was written by God.
Inspired by God to remove any question about whether or not you can trust what it says. But all of this is part of a framework. It's part of a coherent framework. The Bible has to be divinely inspired, because if it isn't, and there's only one God, and if you don't do what he says, he's going to damn you to eternity for endless torture, that would be too cruel. So the Bible has to be right. It has to be accurate so that you can follow it, so that you can be saved. This is part of the structure. They go hand in hand. You can't separate them without pulling apart the entire medieval worldview, which is what the Protestant Reformation did. When it pulled these apart, the entire framework of medievalism collapsed. It didn't make sense anymore.
But wasn't there a part that was not an artifact, because like there was a division between the celestial and the terrestrial world. The celestial world was not an artifact. It existed at least with God, Yeah. So therefore, in a sense, isn't that what made it so astonishing when when Galileo said, no, wait a minute, the celestial world is also changing. So,
That's right.
So there was a part that was not an artifact.
That's right. But we didn't get to live in that part until
Yeah.
after we went through the drama and were saved.
Okay.
Once we went through the drama and were saved, we would be allowed to participate in that. But in the world that we actually live in, yeah, we've got all these issues.
So here's a fun fact, just quick. Bible means Book of Instructions before leaving Earth. That's the acronym.
Yes. Which, by the way, was very Egyptian. The Egyptian Book of the Dead was a book of instructions for the Pharaoh on how to navigate the heavens after death. So we got hands. So I guess Phil and then MJ.
No, I already asked my question. So
okay, thanks, Phil. MJ, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute.
Wait a minute.
Sorry. It just seems to me that, the natural world is based on experience. You see the sea, it reacts. This acceptance of there is this higher thing all of a sudden that, through generations, basically accept the party line, the religious line. It's bowing to power. It's forcing people to accept things they can't see, and that's a test. And I don't want to get into Calvinism, but I'm seeing it coming along.
Yeah, we will. In fact.
Okay, but it's I hate to say it, but it's also along the same lines. People are no longer living on the land. They're coming into towns. They're looking for that community. Who do you have? You have your church. Well, you might if you're the right size religion or flavor. And in order to prove that you really are, 1984, how many hands am I holding up?
Exactly.
Yeah, you're going to eat today if it's the right number. So just that flow of what else is changing in the society and the people and the power of the church that it now has, where Poseidon didn't care. The guy down the street, if half your town didn't believe in Poseidon, you could still. Right. That was it. That was my question and my comment.
Yeah, thank you, MJ. So about that, a couple of things. One is, most people don't know that in Europe, Christianity started out as an urban religion, and the countryside stayed heathen and pagan. These days, it is, especially in the US, it's the rural areas that claim to be the real Christians, and they say the cities are all corrupt. But what happened in the medieval era is that when Christianity spread, it spread by marrying its daughters to kings. And the kings lived in cities. And so they were converting the cities first. When a heathen king would convert to Christianity and say, our entire nation is now Christian, what he actually meant is, one city and 3 medium-sized towns are Christian, and who cares what the villagers think? They'll do whatever we tell them to do. And so the villages, the 99% of the lands in these places that were ostensibly Christian were still pagan and heathen. It was just the cities and parts of the towns that had converted to Christianity. It was an urban religion that spread, among the ruling powers, and that was a follow through. That flavor of Christianity, that medieval Christianity. This is one of the ways in which you can get it sent, because this is the same orthodoxy that had to cozy up to the pagan authorities in Rome in order to become the state religion. So in order to be accepted, it had to become a religion of power and a religion of cities. And once it did that and it won and the medieval era began, it remained a religion of cities and power for most of the medieval era. Even, the reason that the Inquisitions were as violent as they were is that the church was belatedly trying to impose Christianity on rural areas that still weren't Christian, like the Basque country between Spain and France, which, by the way, is where the very worst of the Spanish Inquisition happened. The most torture, the most cruelty, the most genocide. They were trying to belatedly exterminate a pagan religion they hadn't got around to killing off yet. And the reason they hadn't got around to it is their focus was the cities. Christianity was an urban religion, and especially among those who wielded power, which again is medieval Christianity. because this is, of course, a huge inversion from early Christianity, right? This is another way in which it was the opposite of early Christianity. So, but this point about artifice being a virtue and nature being a vice, right? What's a vice? Eating is a vice. Well, the ancients thought eating was a virtue. I mean, anybody take a bite of a sweet apple, it's delicious, right? This is not a horrible thing. This is not a sword being put through you. It's a yummy apple. Obviously, it's a virtue. Anybody can taste that it's a virtue, right? Being kind to someone and having them smile at you, having sex with somebody, all these things were virtues in the ancient world because you could naturally experience the joy that came with them. But for a medieval religion of artifice, an artificial God needs you to reject everything natural and see it as a vice. And only things that are artificial are virtues. So eating became a vice. Now, granted, in theory, it's gluttony. But in practice, you can accuse anybody of gluttony. Just wait until the moment when they're eating and they smile. Ah, you're a glutton. You're enjoying your food too much. Anytime you want to tear someone down, you can always pounce on them if you want to. It's one of those, it's like attacking women for not being thin enough. I don't care if somebody's a scarecrow. You can still make them feel self-conscious and obsessed about whether they're eating too much. They eat that one celery stick and you're like, shouldn't you have eaten half a celery stick? It was a way to gaslight people by the things that they had to have that were built into them biologically, that naturally they need and crave. You could shame them for it. You shame people for being natural, right? And the same is true for sex. The same is true. You look at the whole suite of, the core vices under the medieval church. They're things that were virtues under the ancient world. And the things that are expected of you, the kinds of deprivation, the kinds of, doing what you're told, even when you know that it's wrong, but you have to submit to God's agents on earth. Why wouldn't you just rebel? Well, no, because rebellion is a sin and you'll go to hell. You must obey, right? Because the king was appointed by God, or at least the medieval God. He was appointed by the medieval God. He rules by divine right. And whatever he wants to do to you must be what God wants. And so you have no right to rebel. There was a huge theological component to all the attempts to put down peasant rebellions, right? They were going to go to hell because they were doing what came naturally to them. And they should have done, under the medieval recipe, what came artificially to them, what they had to struggle for. They should have suppressed what came naturally to them. There's an exact inside out. And then think about it. Remember that there is a dualism in the medieval church that isn't present in the early Christian church. Early Christianity is very different from the later dualism of God and Satan. In fact, in some ways, the God-Satan juxtaposition is a heresy. The idea that there's two gods is kind of a Manichaean idea. This is imported from other religions, but it allowed there to be an enemy powerful enough that you could justify doing whatever it took. It's like, I know we're treating you cruelly, but if we don't defeat Satan, we'll all go to hell, and that would be terrible. So really, you have to bear up under this torture. And by torture, I mean I took more of your crops than I should have. I know last year I left you enough to eat with, and this year I didn't. But Satan, so do what I say. There is this way in which there's a reason why the Protestant rebellion was so angry about corruption and hypocrisy, is that once you set this framework in place, the only way to avoid corruption is to make absolutely sure that the hierarchies of politics, economics, and religion are never infiltrated by someone with a corrupt bone in their bodies. If even one person gets in there and starts misusing the powers, it calls into question the entire theological framework of medievalism. After all, if these people were appointed by God and this guy is doing the opposite of what Jesus said, what does that mean? And that's a question a medieval church could not allow to be asked. And so they had to keep asserting that the hierarchies are all pure and perfect and good, or at least forgiven, something. Anyway, don't question them, just do what they say. That rigidity, that inability to honestly root out their own corruption without calling into question the entire cosmology became the Achilles heel that undid medievalism by the end. But you could see how they would get set in motion that way as part of the arguments that they put in place. There is a critical element here which is fascinating, and this is the thing I most wanted to hit today, and I think we're gonna make it. And that's this. Remember, the ancient worldview had this idea that there is this basal metabolic level of human character which is kind of beastly, and it comes naturally to people. but that we also naturally contain the potential to be better than that. And that if we cultivate those parts of our character and we struggle and strive, then we can improve our natures. We can have a superior nature and do more good in the world. This is sort of core to the idea of all these heretical movements that arose. We don't have to just behave however comes easily to us. We can strive to raise ourselves up to follow Jesus's example. That belief is an ancient belief. That's an ancient belief. That was the ancient belief about the nature of free will and determinism. They believe we have a duty to cultivate ourselves and each other, to strive to do better than the baseline default. Right? This was the notion of arete, to try to raise yourself up towards a pinnacle. And this was the notion of the entire caste of the Aristoi, that these should only consist of people who have done that work and are doing that work and are striving to overcome themselves. Now that striving that makes eristic life possible was the highest value in the ancient world. So what did the medieval world do to that? It turned it inside out, while at the same time harnessing it. So on the one hand, they said to believe that you can lift yourself up is a sin. That's pride. You'll go to hell for that. Only God can save you. Nobody else can save you. Only God. You must not believe you can save yourself. If you believe that, you're wicked. Right? This was a response to centuries of frustration and aggravation with late Roman Empire. They had very good reasons to be angry. Conditions were just really shitty. So they didn't want to catch anybody claiming to be better than anybody else. We're all equal in the eyes of God. We're all sinners. We've all fallen. We're all imperfect. And you're not going to save yourself. God's going to save you if you follow his commandments, if you do what he says. If you don't do what he says, it doesn't matter what you do. Right? If you don't believe that Jesus is here to save you, then it doesn't matter how kind or good you are, you're going to hell. This was part of the medieval framework. It was necessary as their core gotcha against the aristocrats of the ancient world, to say, you all thought you were better than everybody else, but look at the corrupt world you made. Obviously, you're going to hell. Unless you abase yourself. Get down here in the muck with the rest of us. You like looking down on slaves? Well, let me tell you, Jesus is going to save the slaves, but he might not save you. You need to recognize that we're all slaves. Then he might save you. So on the one hand, it absolutely destroyed the possibility of improving yourself. The theology did. But on the other hand, remember, they're asking for all this artificial contranatural stuff. The only virtues are contranatural virtues. You have to suppress your natural inclinations. And the only examples we have of that of the past are the Aristoi, who worked on taming. Remember the golden mean of Aristotle. You're working not to not go to excess with your eating, to not go to excess with sex, to not go to excess with anything, but to keep yourself within a healthy range. That idea of taming yourself and leashing yourself, which the ancients believed only the Aristoi could do, the medieval said anybody can and should do that. They popularized eristic striving and made it a duty of all human beings to strive, not to save themselves, because that's impossible, but to work to follow God's will, to listen for God's will, to do what his agents on earth say, to strive and strive and strive against your nature, to do the artificial things that the medieval God wants you to do. And if you can do that, you will be rewarded with eternal paradise. This was the first time in European history that anybody had asserted that all human beings have a duty to strive to do better than what comes naturally to them. The ancient world used to, well, as we saw, deify what comes naturally to us. But in the medieval world, we said what comes naturally to you is wrong. You have to strive to do better. Everybody has to strive to do better. It was a new message. It was a new idea for Europe, anyway. And there is good in that, mixed in with the toxic stuff, that the churches abandoned when they left the medieval era, when they moved into the modern era, they gave up a whole bunch of this toxic stuff. But one of the things that's in there that's good, that some of them kept, is this idea that all people have the capacity to strive to do better. You don't just have to do whatever comes naturally. Just because you're angry doesn't mean you hit somebody. You could learn to forgive. Even if you were really angry. I mean, I've been rereading Calvin and Hobbes, and the number of times he's like, but what if I'm really angry? Now there's like, he's like a force of id and imagination put together. And you can hear Augustine and Aquinas and others arguing with him in response, going, but the whole point is to overcome what comes naturally to you, even though it's easy, and do the thing that instead is hard for you, which is to forgive and to be good and to be wise. So there's this possibility of the democratization of virtue that the ancients didn't believe in, but that is built into the theology of the medieval world. Ginny and then Phil. Go ahead, Ginny.
Well, I'm just thinking as you're talking about how things were so gray and dark during Middle Ages, I'm just thinking, aren't we lucky that we didn't live during that period, and we're living right now, and we can just be free and have a good life, basically. I mean, that's what I think. Our life seems awfully better than, although when I was a little girl, I must say, all those fairy tales of Middle Ages seem awfully romantic, but
yeah,
not right now, not today.
Part of what's going to happen as we talk about the medieval era is that it is both going to seem worse than we were taught, and then paradoxically, it's going to seem better than we were taught. This I wanted to emphasize this point, because this idea that anybody could struggle to do better, even though they won't save themselves, in fact, they have a duty to struggle to overcome their nature, to do the right thing. This idea is one of the most powerful ideas in European philosophical history. And the ancients just didn't have it, really. Not until the late ancient period do you see it spreading out some among the Stoics and Epicureans. But in the early periods, they believed that character is fate. And whatever character you were born with, you might be able to cultivate it, or you might be unlucky, and that's just how you're going to be forever. And it was society's job to put up with you and figure out what to do with you. But once you enter the medieval era, now everybody has a duty to strive, not just a chosen few. Everybody should be struggling to be good. And that idea, even though at first it was hard to find a place in the political social order of Orthodox medievalism, it ultimately was the idea that spread all over Europe throughout the non-clergy, throughout the rank and file of Christianity, and became the force that led to the Protestant Revolution. So it's a revolutionary force, and we owe the medievals for it. And the whole idea of freedom, that anybody could exercise their will to do the right thing, is accidentally a medieval invention. Because caste systems in the ancient world tended to be rather rigid. The idea that it could all be overthrown, that's a revolutionary idea. That's why the medieval revolution was a revolution. There was a great leveler. Jesus says frequently about the high shall be made low and the low shall be exalted. There is a whole idea of overthrowing rigid social order and replacing it with a brotherhood of man. That was a very non-ancient idea. All right, Phil, go ahead. Get your hand up. And your mute's on.
I was thinking something a little different from what you're saying, is that what Augustine did was to take the aspirations,
yes,
Plato, and turn it into a promise.
Yes.
A promise for the future is different from the aspiration for the future.
It is.
A promise, in some sense, could be coin, could be coinage, particularly with the advent of indulgences, which you could buy. and now we are creating futures, which is a promise that is exchanged in coinage in the markets. It just seems so funny. That would be very different if the market saw the future as an aspiration. rather than something that is purchasable.
Right.
So that's interesting. They fell into a marketing structure even within that, because it turned out that, you know, you could be just a rich person and you could just kind of buy these indulgences and get yourself promised into the future, which is interesting. So I just want to inject that in a sense that is manifested then now in the modern world, you know, economic structure.
Yeah, these things get really transformed as they go from epoch to epoch. That's right. So I guess the point I wanted to hit on this was that the bad things and the good things about the medieval epoch don't just exist side by side. They're often the exact same thing in different contexts, and that they're not there by accident. The whole framework has to be there for it to hold together. And what we learn from that is that that's true of every epoch, that the worldviews are constructed out of a set of premises that need each other. And if you pull out even one crucial premise, the whole thing collapses. There's a number of ways for an epoch to come apart. And it teaches us to go back and look at the ancient world differently and say, well, why was there a revolution against it? Why did it fail? Because what you see in the medieval epoch is the response to the late ancient lack of faith, what Gilbert Murray calls the loss of nerve, that they gave up. The premise that the natural order is good, the premise that there are people of better natural character who you can trust to govern you, they didn't believe it anymore, because the Roman Empire in the late ages was so bad that they're like, you all suck. We don't believe any of you are better than we are. And we think many of you are a good deal worse than we are. And we've had it. We've had it with the whole premise that we're going to be able to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps through our own characters and through striving and make a better world. Because by the time of the late Roman Empire, it had become very good at turning people's efforts against them, so that the harder you worked, the more trapped you were. It destroyed people's faith in the future. And when people are in such existential agony and physical agony, they need to escape. They have to get out. They have to. There's a reason why the response to an immanentalist ancient natural order was a transcendentalist artificial order. We have to get out of the natural world and go somewhere safe. We need someone to take care of us. And Jesus is the best thing we've seen to come along, so we're getting on that train. And even if the orthodoxy is cruel, the promise of being able to get out of this mess, we need it so badly that we're willing to put up with a great deal. It tells you something about the late Roman Empire and how people felt, right? You can imagine the frustration and despair and the need to get out. So this is why there's this big inversion. So again, to hit this idea, eristic striving, which was the highest virtue of the ancient order, has been converted from striving to become a better person into striving to submit and obey. If you submit your will utterly to God's, and you utterly obey what he wants you to do, or at least what his agents on earth tell you that he wants you to do, that is the pinnacle of achievement of self-discipline, the self-struggle. That's what life's all about. The struggle to do that instead of the struggle to become a better person. So it's been turned inside out. The slavishness that the ancients despised as a sign of inferior character was the end goal of eristic striving in the medieval world. Now, instead of striving to stop being a slave, you were striving to become a slave, but just of the one good master, the only master worth having. Do you see the irony in this? Yeah. I mean, there's an enormous inversion, but you can see why, if you'd had it with Rome, this is what you would say. I would rather be a slave to Jesus than be free under these corrupt Caesars, because there isn't really freedom for anybody in this mess, and everything is so awful. All right, that was one of the core points. We might have to do this one more week, God help us. Another concept the concept of benevolence. In the next sentence, he says, and we've quoted this a couple times, but I want to stress it differently. Not obscure fate, to which Zeus and the Olympians had to defer as a higher power, but the rational and moral will of a benevolent divinity was now the ultimate source of order, the ruling arche that accounted for the way the world was. When we talked about this last week, we talked about the way that in the ancient world, they believed there were many arche. Nature is full of archai, and they are all fountains of order and generative powers. There's multiple principles at work, and that they're harnessed together into a great complex organism of life that spans the whole world, and that we find ourselves trapped within these archai. And so part of our duty to become wise is to look around ourselves and learn what they are and figure out how they work so that we can harmonize ourselves with all of these archai. And the medieval world said it didn't work. Whatever it was you thought you were doing, it failed, and it ended up in corruption and catastrophe. So we say all of your archai are not archai at all. That's just nature. There's only one arche, and it's God. He is the one single fountain of all order. So stop looking at the rest of it and just look at that one. And furthermore, he's benevolent. You would be lucky to be subject to his will, because you've had some pretty terrible masters for the last several centuries. You know how bad it can get. God's not like any of that. God's benevolent. They're malevolent. God's benevolent. But what did benevolence mean? This is a hard pill to swallow. The notion of benevolence was transforming from the concept of virtue, someone who had cultivated themselves to be a good person and could now show other people the way and teach them and at least give them a good life. It had been changed from that to, you have two choices: eternal torture or eternal reward. If you, I will not force you to be tortured for all eternity. And I will not flood the world anymore and kill you all. I know I used to do those things, but I'm not going to do that anymore. I may want to beat the holy crap out of you, but I will hold back my fist. And in holding back my fist, that's an enormous improvement over what you've been getting lately from your secular rulers. That is benevolence. I didn't hit you today. I might have showed you the fist. You can see hell is right there. But I'm not going to make you go there. I'm going to show you the door that leads to heaven, and you can walk through it if you want to. I won't stop you from making the right choice. Even though in the past I might have, committed genocide across entire lands and despoiled them, and that, sure, okay, but I don't do that anymore. Unless you choose wrong. And then I will beat the shit out of you until the end of time, and there will be no end of time. It will never stop happening. I want you to think about what kind of benevolence that is. This is an abusive family, right? Anybody who's grown up, as I did, in an abusive family knows this pattern exactly. You should thank me for not beating you today, because boy, did I want to. But I overcame my mighty rages. I labored mightily against my desire to stomp the living shit out of you. I held back. And so you can praise me for the rest of the day, and then we'll see how tomorrow is. I might hit you then, but we'll see. But today, I am a benevolent patriarch. This is how a lot of it reads. And this is what the core theology of eternal damnation versus eternal reward is about. And you think, why were they so damn extreme? And the answer is, they were trying to stamp out heresies. Remember, they came out of the gate with 18 horses all running in every different direction. They're like, for the love of God, stop it. Okay, if not for the love of God, then for the fear of God, stop it. So if you don't fear God, it's going to be over for you. It will never be over for you, and it will always be bad. So they had to keep raising the stakes until they could finally find some level of stakes so extreme that even the most hardcore contrarian would be like, oh, all right, I'll go along with it, right? This is how you end up with an apocalyptic theology that's based on, such extremes. And remember how we've talked about the law of the excluded middle in past weeks, and the either or, things are true or false, you're rewarded or you're tortured. This extreme division found a home in Aristotelian logic of the excluded middle. Things are true or false, you're saved or you're damned. Everything is black or white. And that's the stakes they had to raise things to get people to comply with the orthodoxy. But the problem is, once you've set that in motion, you now have a lot of problems in your theology. Because if God is all good, then what the hell is there a hell for? How can eternal torture be reconciled with infinite goodness? And the passages in the Old Testament where God is saying, if you don't carry this ark before you to afflict the people of Canaan who I wish to exterminate, then I will surely afflict you. So you better take me into battle, because I'm going to hit somebody today. And if you don't want it to be you, if you want it to be those Canaanites, lead the ark out before you, and I will smite them instead of you. Right? So there's this stuff that they came out of the gate with that they couldn't get rid of, and later they had to rationalize it. So part of the core is the idea that benevolence now is about withholding the fist. That's the deal. The deal is, you all know I could do it. You've seen me do it before, but I won't as long as you do what I tell you to do. Sharon and then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon.
I'll just be very quick here, because I want to ask a question here, because farther on down, I see here on the first paragraph, but then on the third paragraph, he says, this is what man's modicum of spirit means.
Yes.
And in the New Testament, it says, Paul exhorts you to live a life of the fruit of the Spirit, which is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, trustworthiness. That's what all that is, right? And I think you're talking about God, when he destroyed the world by flood in the time of Noah, he promised at that time that he would never destroy the world by water again, but by fire and brimstone. And when Paul was on the Isle of Patmos, some of that came through also. And that was part of, I don't want to say the intimidation, but the fear of getting you to be good. But the fruit of the Spirit that they talk about in the New Testament, I think that's what the benevolence for you as a human being is all about. Right.
That we've got this is what's going on in the medieval era, is that the orthodoxy is stressing this Old Testament fire and brimstone God, at the same time that what's spreading throughout most people is this other God, the God of love and forgiveness and spirit. And they're coexisting side by side with each other. And it's creating an enormous energy, but it's also creating an enormous tension that's ultimately going to tear apart the medieval era in the end, because they're not actually compatible with each other. Correct. They're incompatible theologies. And the one that was the most helpful in the beginning for stamping out heresy and overcoming the pagans turns out to be the big embarrassment after you've won. And now you really should have been stressing the other side of the theology all this time, the love, the forgiveness, the kindness, the self-effacing part. And instead, you're already several centuries into this hierarchy that's used to taking itself seriously and patting itself on the back and demanding praise. And then there was all these people going, yeah, but didn't Jesus say we should be self-effacing and kind and loving? And that contradiction sails right through the middle of the medieval era. That's where everything goes. Yeah, you're right, Sharon. They're both there at the same time. And they can't be reconciled. And in the end, they're not. They have to split. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I could understand a kind of like frustration with the ancient system, which is a very complex system that you wish it could be more simpler to understand. I use as the contrast between of a symphony. You could have a symphony of orchestra of excellent players.
Yeah.
But if they're just excellent by their own right, you can never get a symphony together. So you do understand the need for a conductor.
Yes.
But a conductor who inspires you rather than commands you is very different.
Yes.
Right? You might get similar results, but you're going to get a lot of resentment.
From the first one.
From the second one, the one who just commands you and berates you for whatever it is. Yes. And sort of the other person who actually explained and sort of like it and sort of inspire you. Okay, yeah, you have to coordinate this complex system together. So I do understand that sort of desire to find some order in a complex system. That part is good. but how it's manifested makes a world of difference between the command structure and a kind of more sort of like passive obedience structure.
I think you need a little of both, though, particularly if you raise children. You need a little of both.
Maybe
too much explaining doesn't get it done.
Is that the relationship between the good cop and the bad cop?
Yes.
The father and the mother.
Good cop, bad cop.
The bad cop. Yeah, right.
Good cop, bad cop is the medieval theology in a nutshell.
Yes.
At its core, it's good cop, bad cop, right?
Yeah.
And the reason that it succeeded is that it was in ways that were really important at the end of the ancient era. It was an improvement over the ancient era.
Yeah.
One of the things that we've done in past sessions, we're wrapping up now. Obviously, I didn't get through all of it. We'll finish up the medieval next week.
Got through most of it.
We got through most of it.
Yeah.
One of the things that I haven't stressed, and that Kenneth doesn't stress, is that the ancient epoch is not to use one of Stephen's terms, it's not a utopia. We should not be Hellenophiles of the sort who say, if only I could live in ancient Athens. We would not be happy there. Ancient Athens has, what's fascinating about it is that its virtues are bigger than our virtues, but its vices are also bigger than our vices. As Gilbert Murray says, you know, a kind of savagery, by which I don't mean anything that indigenous people have been called, but I mean a kind of enthusiastic cruelty is sort of just under the surface of the ancient world. You got to remember, the ancient world is not the first epoch. It's only the first one that we have writing about. There are older epochs. And if you go back far enough, which is something we'll do next week, I'm gonna take us back before the ancient epoch next week in order to put the ancient epoch and the medieval in perspective, and show us a little bit of what came before. Because if you go back far enough, there was a period before organized warfare when people didn't have the power to impose themselves on each other because they just weren't that powerful.
Yeah.
And it was a very different world. Part of what characterizes the ancient epoch is an era of conquerors. It is an era of people who are imposing themselves on other people.
Mm-hmm.
And it means that whatever their virtues may have been, if you were one of the people that they were going to impose themselves on, it was not nice. They were not doing it for your benefit. Even if later they rationalized that they were. Even if some of them were better masters than others. Ultimately, it's not a nice thing. It's not a nice thing. And it could be very cruel. Sometimes in the Peloponnesian War, there's part of why you have to read Thucydides as the Peloponnesian War. In one passage, he'll talk about the speeches that they gave from the wall about why they shouldn't fight, why we can't agree with you, but we don't want to fight with you. We just want to be two separate city-states. And you'd be like, wow, the level of reason and compassion and wisdom involved in that is amazing. And then would follow a battle where they would kill everybody. They just slaughter the entire city. And you're like, these are the same people? How can the people who said that now turn around and do this? And it's one of the things that Nietzsche said about the Greeks, is that they're fascinating because they're so alive in ways that are so alien to us, both in the good and the bad. Their vices are spectacular. You can see
was it during this period that there was cannibalism even going on among lower class? I mean,
I've writes about that.
Let's see.
Gilbert
One
Murray
of the
writes about
meetings
this
that I've gone to
with
the ancient Greeks, there was some cannibalism going on during that period, I thought.
I'm sure
and I was absolutely shocked.
I'm sure
it was not happening
Bronze
much
Age collapse there was.
Yeah, it wasn't happening during the classical era. It was happening earlier during the Dark Age more.
That's right.
But one of the nasty secrets, of course, is that cannibalism happens in every era, including this one.
Yes.
It just isn't very common.
So Rick, wouldn't it be fair to say that all these epochs, all these time periods, all these civilizations, they oscillate around a median, and that median keeps shifting, right? And what that median is just depends on the time, but it's like a cycle. Yes?
Hegel says it's a helix.
Oh, it's a helix.
So you come back two similar themes, but when you come back, you're at a different stage of development. And so you never actually return to the same spot. That even though you might be returning to a new transcendental era, you do it in a completely different way than you did the last time, because you've built on the lessons that led you out of the previous transcendental era.
Yeah, because
but now you transcendentalize in a different way.
Yeah.
You're bringing those lessons forward.
Anyway, Pelagius showed up and admonished them all. You guys are just looking for an easy ride. They decided he was the heretic. This is the trouble with when there's too many ex-Christians around, and their whole preference is for the easy ride. Now, I would love an easy ride as well. I vote easy ride. The only trouble is I pose the question, are we really in for an easy ride? And when I pose that question, people want to burn me at stake.
So let me wrap up by underscoring what Stephen said.
I prefer the call. I prefer to accept what Sharon says and just label her as a psychopath.
Let me underscore what Stephen said as our wrap for today, because there's an interesting point here, which is that thing about striving, that thing about not letting life be easy, not taking the easy path because it leads downward, but taking the difficult path that leads up. The democratization of the heuristic struggle, even if it was towards slavery instead of away from it, it's you see it in Kierkegaard. When Kierkegaard says, I look around the world today and I see all kinds of people working to make life better and easier for their fellow men. And I think, how can I contribute to an age like this? And he says, then I had it. What if instead of making everything easier, I can make everything more difficult? And that becomes his life's mission. And people mostly read it and don't understand it and think he's just being contrary. But what he's doing is evoking that spirit of medievalism and that heuristic spirit of the ancient world, and saying, doing the easy thing doesn't usually lead to good outcomes. We have to cultivate a spirit of striving, and that he could bring that to the philosophy and say, instead of easy answers, I'm going to bring you all difficult questions. And that in your striving to wrestle with them, you'll become better people than you would have been. That is that idea where we can trace this weird embrace and rejection at the same time of the heuristic mission as a core part of the medieval theology. And here in the modern era is Kierkegaard picking it up again and using it to critique the modern age, because as Stephen rightly criticizes, the modern age is always trying to con people into picking the easy answers.
I'm a bit worried with this younger generation that says too easy all the time.
Right.
That's their goal. Too easy.
Yes.
Well, Eric Christensen has been focusing on Kierkegaard for. I've been attending his meetings for over a year, and he's in his house. He has one shelf just dedicated to Kierkegaard books. So I have to bring that up with him when I go to his meeting on Friday. Eric Christensen from Chicago, huh?
I love that quote so much.
Okay, I have to. I don't remember Eric saying that quote that you just said. So I'll bring that up.
Because from a modern perspective,
say it again. Can you repeat it? Repeat the quote, please.
Kierkegaard says he looks around him thinking about what he's going to do with his life, and he sees that everybody is working to make things better for everybody else, easier. And he says, in the spirit of such an age, how can I help? And then he says, I've got it. Instead of making everything easier, I'm going to make everything more difficult.
Okay.
He actually phrases it as, what if I just make everything harder? and your first reaction as a modern is, well, that's perverse. That's crazy. Why would you want to make everything harder? And it's not until you get the philosophy involved that you're like, no, that's right. People should be striving against the false easy answers and looking for
these people don't believe in.
Is that the same as Don Quixote, Cervantes' Don Quixote, to dream the impossible dream? Is that of the same vein?
There's a lot of Don Quixote in that statement.
It's difficult to build character.
Right? Yeah.
Difficulties.
Bill's character.
And the New Testament talks about it too. It says, when you have your difficulties, consider them joy, because suffering builds perseverance. Perseverance builds strength.
See?
Paul talks about that. I'm sorry,
right.
guys. I've had religion in my drinking water from before I came out the womb. I know it.
I love it. And I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here. Because, this is one of the ways in which you can see how the ancient ethos of striving is being transformed by Paul. He's not rejecting it. He's embracing it and using it to a new purpose. And it's part of the transformation, the emergence of the new religion.
Well, no, look, I embrace that, but also let's not overdo it, okay? I mean, there is a point when you can overdo that as well. Make it so difficult that it's impossible.
Well, I have to go, so thank you, Rick, so much.
Just takes a little longer, Phil, and it's all about balance.
Okay.
Right? All right.
So
Thank you again.
See you all next week.
Bye, Rick.
Bye.
Bye, David.
Bye-bye.
Moderns next week, right, Rick?
Yeah. We'll finish up medievalism next week.
All right. Bye-bye.